Hey guys, tonight we're heading to a place where the cold bites so hard your exhaled breath crystallizes instantly, where spilled water doesn't puddle but explodes into icy fragments. This is your maiden winter as a wilderness pioneer. You arrived just months ago, fresh to this untamed land, and doubts are already creeping in. The landscape has its beauty, no question about that. Ancient trees murmur secrets older than recorded history. Stars blanket the sky beyond anything you imagined possible, but daylight's retreating faster now, and bitter cold penetrates everything, seeping deep into your very marrow. Here's the harsh reality. Odds are you won't make it through. But let's play along anyway. Before we settle in, hit that like button and subscribe if you want. Only do it if you truly appreciate what happens here, and drop a comment telling me what time you're tuning in and where you're listening from. I genuinely love discovering these little midnight spaces you call home. Go ahead and dim those lights. Maybe switch on a fan for that gentle white noise backdrop. Now let's slip into tonight's tale together. Our story begins in the waning days of October. You've just finished throwing together your first crude log shelter. No proper insulation, no real windows, and a door that protests with every movement. There's a fireplace of sorts, but the chimney draws poorly, filling your space with stinging haze that transforms every piece of clothing into a smoky relic. Your hands are split and bleeding, your mouth cracked beyond repair, and darkness isn't waiting for you to sort things out. Initially, there's almost a romantic quality to it. You simmer broth over open flames, bundle yourself in whatever covers you hauled from civilization, and share tales beside dancing light. This must be what true independence feels like, you tell yourself. But temperatures continue their relentless descent. One morning you discover your water pail turned to solid ice inside your shelter. The following dawn you venture outside to hear snow compress underfoot with sharp, brittle snaps like breaking crystal. Your first genuine frontier winter doesn't announce itself politely. It batters down barriers and claims territory, and you're completely unprepared. Here's lesson number 1. Winter amplifies every error. Leave the door slightly ajar and watch your fire die. Accidentally burn damp timber and enjoy hacking up your lungs from toxic fumes. Venture outside barehanded too long and kiss goodbye to sensation in those digits. When the freeze settles in, it's not theatrical or noisy. It's silent. That's what makes it terrifying. It slips beneath your collar. It travels with your breath. It lurks. You're rationing everything because what choice do you have? The closest trading post sits 2 full days away, assuming paths haven't disappeared under snowdrifts and fallen timber. That mount you rode in on huddles in a makeshift lean-to, probably questioning every decision that led here too. You portion out his meagre grain rations, wrap his hooves in rough cloth, and hope he survives another week. Inside your shelter you master the art of perpetual layering. You pile on every garment you own, creating some ridiculous textile nightmare, yet still tremble through the night. You press your feet against your dog if you're fortunate enough to have one. You drift off, dreading the moment flames expire, and fantasizing about warmth that never arrives. You attempt establishing better habits. Firewood becomes your obsession, more precious than currency. Every conscious moment involves calculations. Do we have enough fuel to last until morning? Can you split more before sunset turns the forest into a pitch-black labyrinth of sounds and shadows? One documented account from the early 1800s describes a Vermont family who brought chickens indoors during winter to share body heat. Reading that now might seem amusing, but once cold penetrates your bones, nothing seems ridiculous anymore. You'd welcome an entire barnyard into your bed, if it meant surviving one more night. There's an odd detail buried in an old pioneer journal. One fellow claimed he gauged outdoor temperatures by whether his whiskers froze to the cabin wall while sleeping. Sounds absurd until you're sharing space pressed against frost-covered timbers and realise your breathing turns interior walls into icy mirrors. Even now, some people question just how brutal those winters truly were. Certain historians suggest the records exaggerate, that memory and folklore inflate the hardships to transform ancestors into heroes. But others point to actual ice core evidence, early climate variations during the 19th century, and insist no, these people weren't dramatizing. They were barely clinging to life. You begin learning what they understood. Survival doesn't depend on being the strongest. It requires being clever, listening to the environment, mimicking animal behaviors, observing how ice forms and winds shift. You utilize everything available. Cloth scraps jammed into gaps, ash mixed with clay for insulation, coats sewn from pieced-together hides. You discover burning different timber at specific times. Start with resinous pine for tinder, then switch to oak or hickory once flames establish themselves. Dawn arrives late and dusk comes early. You measure time by chimney smoke and the sound of your own breathing in stillness. Sometimes you speak aloud just to hear human voices. When wind screams across ridges at night, it resembles voices crying from the darkness. You start understanding why so many frontier journals mention humming gentle melodies, familiar hymns, even meaningless songs, anything to prevent spirits from shattering. You hum while splitting wood, while sealing roof leaks, while tending flames and praying they endure until morning. By December, the season's first real tempest approaches. You sense it before seeing it. Trees groaning, the world becoming muffled as snow thickens the atmosphere. You bolt your entrance. You pack snow against exterior walls to deflect wind. You consume a meal of stale bread soaked in thin soup and hope supplies last until thaw. That evening, flames sputter weakly. You wrap yourself tighter, listen to the storm outside, and try not to consider how flimsy these logs are, how depleted the fuel pile's becoming. You gaze at glowing embers and wonder if spring will ever return. Welcome to Wilderness Winter. This is merely the start. You discover quickly that survival here revolves around timing. And your timing, frankly speaking, is terrible. That shelter you're cowering in, hastily assembled, barely keeping out the elements. You began construction too late in autumn, assuming fair weather would linger longer than it did. One moment leaves were golden, cascading like celebration confetti from branches. The next, you were attacking frozen earth with metal tools and learning that rock hard isn't just an expression. The structure had to rise quickly. No manufactured fasteners, no processed lumber, just timber notched by hand with a blunt hatchet and perspiration that iced immediately upon contact with air. You developed blisters layered on blisters, and the chinking, that mud and vegetation mixture you cram between logs to block drafts, that's crumbling away now, literally. Each time wind howls, small pieces of your barrier scatter across the floor as if attempting to rejoin the wild, which, honestly, they sort of are. You didn't complete the roof until first snowfall. There was one evening you had to drape canvas overhead and pray it wouldn't cave in during sleep. Next morning you awakened dusted with snow indoors. Poetic in concept, miserable in reality. There's no manual. You're operating on intuition, recollection, and maybe a smudge sketch in an old almanac. The entrance doesn't seal properly. Corners aren't true. There's a mysterious current that seems to originate from everywhere simultaneously. Still, it's standing. And that's more than many settlers could claim. One frontier diary from an Illinois homesteader described constructing a dwelling in just 5 days before hard frost arrived. Roof of bark and soil, floor still grass and mud. The man's spouse delivered their child inside that structure, while wind whistled through seams. She bundled the infant in rabbit pelts and hoped predators stayed beyond the tree line. Now that's authentic rustic living. Something peculiar happens after several weeks in a barely adequate cabin. You develop pride. You recognize every creak in the timber, every knot in the grain, every loose plank requiring stabilization with stone or kindling. It's chaotic, but it's your chaos. When wind roars and you stay dry, you consider it victory, even if your breath still mists indoors. No glass for openings naturally. too costly, too fragile, too unnecessary according to veteran settlers. You simply leave gaps, perhaps covering them with oiled paper or stretched animal membrane, translucent enough to admit slivers of light, insufficient to exclude cold, but once snowbanks against exteriors, you're grateful for anything that slows the breeze. Naturally, building during winter presents its own absurd torment. Some folks had no alternative. A survival account from Michigan tells of a family who inhabited an excavated hillside for half a year, literally a cavity in the earth covered with logs and dirt. No proper chimney, just an opening at the top for smoke to escape. Snow would melt over the fire, then refreeze sliding down the rear wall. The children dubbed it the drip house. Honestly, compared to your current shack, it might have been comfortable. What historians continue debating is how much of this struggle was intentional versus pure desperation. Did people genuinely believe they were ready? Or were they wagering each season, hoping conditions held just a few more weeks? Some argue early settlers were overly optimistic, blinded by visions of free territory and independence. Others suggest they were pragmatists, simply hardened individuals who understood how to endure storms through determination alone. Regardless, the outcome remains identical. Your inaugural winter is a trial, a prolonged, gradual test of how much misery you can tolerate before losing sanity. And everything depends on whether your little log container can preserve your life. You begin modifying the structure as days shorten. You plug openings with moss and rabbit down. You reinforce weak sections with additional planks or even spare garments. You angle the roof to shed snow, and when it doesn't cooperate, you climb up with a brush and pray you don't tumble into a drift. Inside, you organise everything for warmth. Sleeping area nearest the hearth. Provisions nearby so you don't waste precious heat crossing the room. The fuel supply right beside the entrance. Stacked frantically each afternoon. Yes, you begin categorising your wood pieces by dimensions and form. The heavy logs for overnight burns, the gnarled ones for quick kindling, the pine for when you need instant flame. You learn creativity with your limited space. Pegs in the rafters to hang drying stockings, cordage to prevent pots from toppling on uneven hearthstones. A container near the corner for melted snow you can consume, assuming it doesn't freeze overnight and become an ice sculpture by dawn. At night, the cabin creaks loudly. Cold contracts the wood and pulls everything taut, so each temperature shift makes the logs moan like ancient joints. Sometimes you bolt upright in darkness, certain someone's outside, only to realise it's just your shack adjusting its frame in protest. You eventually talk to the cabin, not in a strange way. Well, okay, somewhat strangely, but it becomes your sole real companion. When wind shrieks and snow pounds the walls, you whisper, "Hold together just one more evening." And sometimes the cabin responds. That connection between you and this patchwork refuge is what carries you through the worst. It's not about comfort, it's about shelter. Your cabin doesn't care about your feelings, but it deflects the wind. It contains the fire. And when you lean against the logs, cold as they are, you feel anchored, supported. Not warm exactly, but not isolated. And out here, that matters more than you realise. The fire is your lifeline, your unpredictable, smoky, moody companion. Without it, you're finished. And unfortunately, constructing a proper hearth on the frontier is less engineering and more improvisational performance art with deadly consequences. You probably assumed a fireplace was simply a cavity in the wall surrounded by stones. How charming. You'll discover quickly there's a distinction between something resembling a fireplace and one that doesn't attempt to eliminate you while you sleep. It begins with the chimney, or more frequently, the attempt at one. You assemble it with fieldstone if you're fortunate enough to find any locally, or clay and twigs if you're desperate. Some settlers even tried constructing their chimneys entirely from timber coated in mud that would theoretically prevent ignition. Sometimes it failed. A smouldering wall wasn't an unusual aroma. Smoke becomes your first instructor. And it shows no mercy. If your chimney's angle is incorrect, if the draft isn't sufficient, If the opening's too narrow or the space too small, smoke doesn't rise. It spreads sideways into your respiratory system, into your bedding, into your essence. You awaken coughing, eyes burning, and every article of clothing permanently reeks of charred pine. You become a living piece of preserved meat. There's this mystical term, smoke shelf, that craftsmen love to mention. Supposedly, it helps direct airflow, improves draft, makes flames breathe better. But out here, you don't have time for elegant ventilation and precision masonry. You're stuffing tinder under logs and hoping flames travel upward. Sometimes they cooperate, sometimes they explode into the room like an angry dragon. A historical note from an 1820s settler in Ohio mentions having to dismantle and reconstruct their fireplace 3 times before it stopped poisoning them. The solution? They finally abandoned design and simply made the opening enormous. Half the wall, really. It consumed wood faster than a bonfire in a windstorm, but at least they stopped suffocating. Each morning you notice small techniques. A hotter fire draws better but devours fuel too rapidly. A wider hearth prevents sparks from jumping into your bedding, but allows more heat to escape. A narrow throat traps smoke. A tall chimney might topple if mortar freezes and fractures. And if you build it too short, snow will bury the top and seal the draft completely, which is a delightful surprise during a blizzard. Still, despite the hazards, the fireplace is the one section of the cabin that feels like home. The dance of light on walls, the crack of sap in timber, the gentle coals glowing crimson. There's a mesmerizing rhythm to it. You sit close at night, spine curved toward the warmth like a feline, and simply gaze into it. You become lost there. You contemplate your previous life back east, the things you abandoned, what on earth you thought you were pursuing when you came out here to play pioneer. Then the fire dies and the cold strikes you directly in the face. Maintaining it through the night becomes your new fixation. You experiment. You try burying larger pieces in coals, raking ash over embers to insulate them, building log cabins or crisscross formations like you're back in youth camp. Except this time, failure isn't embarrassing, it's hazardous, it's terminal. You begin sleeping in segments, not by choice, but because someone must monitor the fire. If you're alone, that someone is you constantly. Your rest becomes choppy, semi-conscious haze. If there's more than one of you, you establish shifts. One person awake every few hours to feed flames, check the chimney, ensure logs haven't rolled onto the floor in some act of fiery rebellion. And yes, that occurs more often than you'd prefer. Some nights your dreams merge with the fire. You see faces in the coals, hear voices murmuring from the smoke. Not spirits exactly, but memories. Old laughter, distant melodies. That strange combination of heat and exhaustion tricks your mind. You wake uncertain of the hour, or even the day. There's an ancient belief among frontier people that if your fire completely expires during night, something gains entry. Not cold, not darkness. Something, they don't specify what. But they never allow the fire to extinguish, even when fuel runs dangerously low. You consider that sometimes when wind rattles the shutters and flames dip weak, you stir the embers quickly just to be safe. Now here's something unexpected. You begin using fire not merely for heat, but for everything. Drying soaked boots, thawing frozen food, sterilizing implements, heating stones to tuck under blankets before sleep, boiling snow for drinking water. Once, in a moment of desperation, you even use coals to warm your shirt before putting it on. You nearly scorch yourself, but it was worthwhile. You start thinking of fire not just as comfort, but as a tool, a multi-purpose resource. Something alive that demands constant attention and nourishment. There was an odd technique the old-timers believed in. Taking smooth stones and heating them beside the fire until they glowed red hot, then wrapping them in fabric and tucking them down at the foot of your sleeping area. Essentially, ancient heated bed warmers. Some would even warm bricks throughout the day and slip them under covers with children come nightfall. The method had merit. Sort of. Those stones held their heat for maybe 2 hours. then turned into cold, heavy lumps. Even so, when bitter winds screamed through wall gaps and your feet felt like frozen wood, that brief warmth meant the difference between rest and trembling until sunrise. Historians continue debating whether frontier hearths were actually well constructed or just fancy smoke chambers. Some believe the designs improved gradually, learning from native fire-building methods or adapting techniques from German and Scandinavian immigrants. Better heating systems. Others maintain that most people simply did whatever functioned and persevered through pure determination and willingness to rebuild repeatedly. Each time it collapsed, you grew accustomed to reeking of ash. It penetrated your flesh, your linens, your hair. The smell became invisible after weeks until visitors arrived or you reached town. Then the contrast struck you like a physical blow. You reeked like chimney interior because essentially that described your dwelling. Yet there were instances, precious and brief, when everything aligned perfectly. The room grew toasty, the timber hissed gently, the gale outside seemed distant. You'd sit hunched toward the warmth and consider whether this struggle had value. You'd draw your covering closer, hear the wood shift and crack, and slip into another restless doze, praying the blaze would endure until daybreak. You learn an entirely different approach to dressing on the frontier, born from necessity rather than appearance. Forget everything you understood about layering before arriving. You don't simply put on garments, you construct them. Each layer builds like placing stones in a barrier between yourself and the advancing freeze. The reality is, mistakes have immediate consequences. The cold here doesn't politely announce itself. It attacks your torso and attempts to crawl up your backbone. Standard clothing becomes an absurd mountain of rough wool, mended cotton, beast pelts, stockings over stockings, undershirts beneath overshirts. You bind your limbs in flannel or grain bag material. You rest wearing your cap. And if you possess sense, you never remove your footwear unless certain they'll dry by morning. Damp boots mean death lurking nearby. The type of error you survive only once if fortune smiles. Your exterior covering proves most vital. Wool reigns supreme here. Dense, substantial, and utterly unfashionable, but it retains heat even when moisture seeps in. Then come the hides. Bunny, possum, coyote, whatever you can snare. Clean and sew. You discover quickly that animal coats aren't merely warm, they're more intelligent than human attempts. Evolution solved this puzzle long before people attempted winter clothing. A common practice among frontier children involved stuffing dried prairie grass inside their garments, improvised insulation that scratched like fire beetles but served its purpose. Certain settlers even used corn shucks. Uncomfortable, unglamorous, but remarkably efficient. An old pioneer expression claimed the more you crinkle, the warmer you stay. This held truth. When you sound like you're concealing a haystack with every movement, you're likely surviving. But there's a balance. Overdressing causes perspiration. Sweat here becomes treachery. Once body moisture saturates your clothing, it crystallizes. Now instead of warmth, you wear a shell of frozen regret against your skin. You begin mastering the careful balance between avoiding frostbite and preventing overheating, even during simple chores like fetching water or splitting timber, lumber. Certain settlers attempted coating their outer garments with animal grease or candle wax to repel moisture. One unusual approach involved rubbing bear fat into hand coverings and shoes, which maintained waterproofing certainly, but also made you smell like prey. That's a dangerous fashion choice when predators prowl nearby. Hand warmers present another challenge. Gloves provide finger movement, but mittens conserve heat better. You select warmth, always warmth. Sometimes, when desperate enough, you wear both finger covers inside mittens, hands bound in fabric and stuffed into wool stockings like pitiful little packages. You cannot grip tools properly, but at least your digits remain attached. Footwear presents constant difficulties. Leather shoes stiffen and split from freezing. Bootstrings snap like dry twigs. You bind your feet in layers of wool, fur, and whatever stays dry. Old papers, if you're fortunate to possess them. You've never appreciated worthless reading material more. You warm socks beside the flame nightly, rotating them like precious artifacts. One ruined pair of foot coverings in bitter weather, and you're facing frostbite with nothing but a worn blade and rough knowledge of how many toes you truly require. There's a documented story of a Dakota woman who fashioned coats from several old blankets sewn together like a patchwork monster. She named it her portable bedroom. Her spouse joked she vanished inside it whenever temperatures fell. Sometimes she did, wearing it even during sleep to never face the bitter cold alone. Experts still argue about frontier clothing effectiveness. Some claim people adapted brilliantly to conditions, adopting native designs like fur-lined footwear or layered coverings. Others say most pioneers stumbled into winter poorly equipped and survived only through creativity and sheer determination. You understand both perspectives. One moment you feel brilliant for sewing fur inside your neckline. The next you're weeping over frozen fasteners that won't close because your fingers stopped functioning. Even inside you stay bundled. The cabin might feel toasty near the flames, but step away and your breath mists before your face. You wear your coat to sleep. You keep your hat on while preparing meals. Removing any layer requires careful consideration. You only undress near the fire, and even then quickly, like racing against the air itself. And washing clothes. Don't make me start. Winter laundry becomes pure nightmare. Water crystallizes before you can rinse. Garments transform into stiff, frozen sculptures. You begin living by the old saying, grime doesn't harm. If something doesn't reek of decay or fungus, it gets worn repeatedly. An interesting detail. Some people slept bare beneath their clothing and coverings to allow body warmth to transfer directly to bedding. Supposedly this maintained better temperature. You attempt this once and it's an adventure. A frigid, terrifying, what was I thinking kind of experiment that sends you scrambling back into your 3 undershirts and 2 pants with fresh appreciation for every fibre. You become intimately familiar with your heat escape points. You sense it departing through your wrists, ankles, throat. You construct your wardrobe around sealing those openings. Neck wraps, head coverings, even torn shirt strips tied around your boots. You're not dressing to attract admiration. You're dressing like someone who has gazed into the void of a frozen morning and declared, "Not today." Yet sometimes it proves insufficient. Certain nights you tremble regardless. You curl like punctuation and breathe heated air into your hands buried deep within your coat. You hear the wind howl outside and think, just hold on. You count the layers you're wearing and wonder how many more it would require to actually feel alive again. But in winter's darkest hours, when each breath feels like shattered glass and every motion hurts, the sole barrier between you and death is your armour of worn fabric and sewn-together pelts. You appear ridiculous. You're rustling. You're wrapped in everything you possess. Yet somehow you endure. You'd assume snow represents your enemy here, the antagonist of this extended frozen story. But strangely enough, snow can rescue you. It's not merely the substance falling from above and transforming your world into a slippery, blinding, ankle-twisting disaster. It's also protection. Real, working, miraculous protection. Once you overcome the shock of existing in a place where your lashes freeze shut, you begin recognizing something. The cabin grows warmer when it's covered. It doesn't occur immediately. Initial snowfalls appear light, almost ornamental, like powdered sweetener on a nightmare. But then arrives the major one, the deluge. The tempest that deposits 2 feet overnight, buries your shovel beneath a mound and blocks your entrance with heavy silence. That's when you sense it. With snow heaped against the exterior walls, the wind ceases screaming, the cabin becomes quieter, the gaps stop bleeding frigid air like vengeful spirits, the timber stops creaking, It's like someone wrapped your home in a muffled, frozen comforter. You learn to value it, this strange alliance with snow. Sure, it attempts to destroy you when you walk through it. It swallows your boots. It conceals your firewood. It transforms trails into traps and toilets into snow-buried puzzles. But pressed against your walls, it actually assists you. Understand that snow functions like Earth's version of insulation foam. It doesn't care about your welfare, but it does capture warmth. There's a method some experienced settlers understood after major snowfall. They'd pack additional snow against cabin walls, shaping it into small hills like white protective barriers. It sounds backward, adding more snow to something you're trying to warm, but it functions. You try it yourself and notice the improvement. Overnight, the interior doesn't feel like frozen storage anymore, just a mildly uncomfortable icebox. It's not only the walls either. You use snow as wind barriers. You shovel it into half walls around the outhouse. You build banks around the animal shelter to shield the creatures from gusts. One particularly windy week, you even attempt burying part of the timber stack, hoping snow will shield it from the worst freeze. It does, somewhat though. The logs become so solid you need the hatchet just to pry them free. This leads to the strangest realization that snow has characteristics. There's powdery snow and heavy snow, light drifts that float and stick to your face, and thick slush that clings to your footwear and drags you down like a weight. You become skilled at interpreting it. You learn to predict how much time remains before the sky releases another batch. You develop into the type who knows snow's weight just from the sound your steps make, a gentle whoosh, probably good for insulation, a sharp crack. Brutal cold. No mercy. One unusual method you hear about involves constructing actual snow shelters, not just for emergencies. Some people inhabited them for complete winters. Settlers in harsh regions or trappers moving constantly would carve snow caverns, even form little domes like makeshift igloos. You dismiss the concept, until one day a sudden storm forces you to dig into a drift just to remain upright. You crawl into a carved-out space, heart racing, and feel the wind disappear inside that tiny frozen cave. The world becomes muted, warmer, safer. You sit there for an hour, wondering if the snow protects you or just waits to cave in. You recall an old frontier legend about a family who had to tunnel out of their house after a 3-day storm buried the cabin to the rooftop. They burrowed through the drift like underground creatures, emerging into a silent, blinding world. Some historians claim the story is embellished, but based on your current experience, you're not certain. There's ongoing debate among scholars about how much settlers actually knew about snow's insulating qualities versus just discovering it accidentally. Some say it was wisdom inherited from Native Americans and learned from watching animal behaviour, foxes nestling into drifts, rabbits digging beneath snowbanks. Others believe settlers learned through hardship, one blizzard at a time, by noticing which cabins stayed warmer and imitating them. Regardless, the knowledge persisted. Even your walking style transforms. Snow teaches you to move differently. You raise your feet higher, place them more carefully, always watching for hidden pits or weak surface. You fear post-holing, that instant when one foot plunges through to your thigh and you're trapped like a cork in a bottle. You learn to tie cord around your boots to prevent snow from pouring inside. And every time you tumble, because you will tumble, you curse, chuckle, and roll around like a miserable snowman. Then there's the silence, the kind of quiet only snow can create. Thick, heavy, absolute. You step outside after a storm and it's like the world has ceased breathing. No birds, no wind, just the soft whisper of flakes brushing together. It's gorgeous and haunting. You find yourself murmuring for no reason, like speaking loudly might disturb something ancient beneath the ice. You begin using snow in small ways too, for water, when you're desperate here and your container's frozen completely solid, for cleaning. If you cannot tolerate your own odour anymore and need a cold shock back to awareness, You toss a handful into your cooking pot and pretend it equals clean water. You know it isn't. You know the snow contains ash, soot, and probably bits of fur. But out here you accept that. An interesting fact you discover in a worn wilderness guide: snow in small amounts can be boiled and strained to make perfectly safe drinking water. But consuming it raw, dangerous. It drops your core temperature. You test that theory one morning, chewing a handful of fresh powder after chopping wood, and within 5 minutes your teeth throb and your body begins shivering. Lesson learned once more. As winter continues, you come to view snow not just as weather, but as a presence in your existence. A moody, unpredictable housemate that sometimes assists, sometimes obstructs, and always overstays its welcome. It's not your adversary, but it's certainly not your ally. Still, when you wake one morning and see the snowbank outside your window glowing soft rose in the sunrise, you forget all that momentarily. It resembles spun glass, like enchantment. You press your palm to the cold timber wall and grin. Perhaps the snow isn't attempting to destroy you. Perhaps it's simply testing you. Eventually you exhaust your wood supply at precisely the wrong moment, because naturally you do. It's always during the middle of the night, or always during a cold spell, and always when you finally manage to slip into the kind of bone-deep sleep that only comes after spending 16 hours wrapped in wool, trudging through snow and consuming something that might have once been a root vegetable. Then the fire begins to weaken. The final log shifts, pops, crumbles into a pitiful pile of glowing orange fragments. You feel the temperature plummet immediately, like someone opened a portal to the Arctic directly beneath your blanket, so you do what you've been dreading all day. You throw the coverings aside, roll out of bed with a groan, and stumble toward the timber pile, only to discover you've already burned the last of what was indoors. You forgot, or someone forgot. Doesn't matter now. It's either freeze or venture out in the darkness to find more. You wrap yourself like a package of desperation: jacket, muffler, gloves, boots still wet from earlier. You grab the lamp, but it flickers weakly, the fuel running low. The wind shoves against the cabin door the moment you open it, and snow blasts into your face like a strike. This isn't a gentle snowfall. This is retribution, the kind of weather that gets whispered about in back corners of trading posts years later. Yet you head outside because you must, because the fire is your pulse, and the cabin's warmth is your circulation, and both are diminishing rapidly. The timber pile, what remains of it, is half buried under a shell of snow and ice. You claw at it with stiff gloves, breathing heavily, your exhalation swirling around your face like a spectre. You find several decent-sized logs, wrestle them free, then some twisted branches for starter material. Your fingers are already deadened and your legs burn from the cold, like the wind stripping your skin away. By the time you stumble back inside, cheeks blazing and boots clomping with frozen snow, you're trembling. Not just from cold, but from adrenaline. The kind of deep, primitive stress that your body unleashes when it realizes you're close, dangerously close to the edge. You thrust the kindling into the fireplace like an offering. You blow softly at first, then more forcefully. The embers resist. You curse them quietly. You speak to them, beg them. You strike a match, the flame weak and delicate. And when the fire finally surges back to life, there's a sense of victory that feels almost absurd. You survived again. Barely. It occurs repeatedly. You're nearly out of wood. Terror. You try to stay ahead of it. You create a new rule. If you're conscious and you see the pile shrinking, you replenish it. No excuses, no forgetting. You don't let it drop below knee height without taking action, because now you comprehend just how close the fire exists to extinction and how much that extinction resembles you frozen in your sleep. Wood splitting becomes the primary fixation of your day. You dream about chopping logs. You measure time in chords. The hatchet becomes a fifth appendage, and the sound of it splitting through timber is the nearest thing to melody you possess. You become an expert of angles. You learn which wood burns quickest. Pine. But it spits resin. And which burns longest. Oak. If you can split it without damming the entire forest. One settler account tells of a man who cut wood every day for 9 months continuously, even in July, terrified that his family would freeze if he ever paused. By winter's end, he'd constructed a wall of firewood so towering his neighbours thought him insane, but his cabin remained warm, and none of them mocked. When January arrived, and their own piles diminished, you begin hiding wood everywhere. Behind the cabin, under the eaves, inside baskets stacked in corners like strange wooden furniture. You even bring several pieces into bed one night, too exhausted to restock the pile and too cold to leave them outside. At that point, firewood becomes as essential to you as food or air. There's continuing scholarly debate about how much fuel a typical frontier family actually required to survive winter. Some say 5 cords, others say 8, even 10 if it was lengthy. But the truth is, you cannot measure it precisely. Every winter differs. Every family has different requirements. Some nights are gentle, others feel like they want to split your cabin apart. The only real rule: it's never sufficient, always cut much more. A marginal trick you attempt involves burning green wood overnight, not because it burns better, it doesn't, but because it burns slower. If you stack it correctly with seasoned logs underneath, the moisture prevents it from burning too quickly. It smoulders, stays hot longer. Of course, it also smokes like a cursed chimney and smells like boiled bark. But if it prevents the cabin from becoming a meat locker, you'll endure it. Eventually, you grow clever. You construct a small covered lean-to just for storing your dry wood. Nothing elaborate. 4 posts, a slanted roof, maybe a canvas tacked over the front. But it keeps the worst snow out, and that makes a difference. You store kindling in a container indoors now, always dry, always ready. You tie a bundle of cedar shavings with twine and hang it by the hearth like fire insurance, yet some nights still escape you. You misjudge. The wood burns quicker than expected. The wind sneaks beneath the cabin, stealing the heat. You wake with your breath clouding before your face and your fingers stiff again. It doesn't matter how much you prepare, winter discovers your vulnerable spots. It always does. An interesting detail from an old trapper's manual mentions people using their own furniture for firewood when things became desperate. You think that's exaggerated nonsense, until one bitter February night you look at the table leg and wonder, just for a moment, how long it would burn. The truth is, fire is more than just heat out here. It's your guardian, your companion. It's also your captor. You're bound to it, obsessed with feeding it, moulded by it. You structure your days around keeping it alive. You go outside when you'd rather not. You chop wood when your hands are already raw. You do it all because without it, you're just another settler-shaped icicle in the woods. So you maintain the fire through the long nights, through the quiet snowfalls and the howling storms, through the hunger, the isolation, the exhaustion. Because as long as there's flame in the hearth, there's still a you in that cabin. You cease sleeping like a normal person sometime in January. There's no 8-hour stretch, no dreams about sunny meadows or featherbeds. Sleep arrives in shifts now. Half sleeps, fire watching, dozes, and that strange kind of awareness where you're uncertain if you're awake, or just hearing the crackle of the hearth from deep inside a blanket cocoon. Either way, you're exhausted constantly. Your body hurts in places you didn't realize could hurt. Your eyes burn from smoke and fatigue. But the fire requires attention and no one else is volunteering. At 3 a.m, you attempted full nights of rest in the beginning. Thought if you banked the fire correctly, threw in several thick logs and heaped ashes over the coals, it would last until dawn. It never did. The fire would die out around 2, and by the time you woke, the inside of the cabin would feel like a forgotten meat locker. You'd damn yourself, jump from bed, stub your toe on the stove, and scramble to relight frozen kindling with hands that could barely function once was enough to convince you. Sleeping through the night was a privilege you no longer possessed, so now you sleep in shifts. If you're alone, you simply don't sleep deeply, never more than an hour or 2 at a time. You keep a stick by the bed to poke the logs from under the covers. You've shifted into a creature of the night, poking at glowing coals, while everyone else sleeps buried under layers of snow-white silence. But when there are others around, family members, friends, maybe that one neighbour who settled in a couple miles up the ridge, you set up a schedule. Everybody takes their turn, even the children if they're mature enough. Sounds reasonable on paper until somebody dozes off during their watch. The flames die out, you all wake up shivering, and suddenly everyone's yelling at each other in the darkness, wrapped up in blankets like furious spirits. This isn't just about comfort, it's about survival, and everybody understands that. There's a pattern to it now. The fire tender rises, stirs the coals, tosses on more wood, adjusts the chimney draught, maybe puts the kettle on or warms up a leftover biscuit on the stone hearth. Sometimes you'll sit there for an hour after feeding the fire, watching shapes dance on the walls. Your breath floating like mist in the pale light. It's silent, oddly calming. You hear the wind howling outside, the occasional snap of a branch breaking under ice, the settling weight of snow on the cabin roof. In the heart of winter, nighttime feels endless. The sun disappears around 4, barely climbing above the tree line by 9, and time becomes fluid. You measure it by firelight and the feel of log walls around you. And the longer you stay awake through those hours, the more sounds you pick up. Little noises, strange echoes. You swear you can hear snowflakes landing sometimes, or the whisper of wind threading through the chimney pipe. One evening, you think you hear someone singing, but everyone else is asleep. Probably just the wind, hopefully. There's an old wilderness belief that the night fire is holy, that it guards against more than just freezing temperatures. In certain cultures, the hearth wasn't merely warmth, it was sanctuary. Let the flames go out and you might invite unwelcome visitors, not just wild animals, but other things. You don't believe much in folklore, but you still keep that fire burning, just to be safe. An interesting detail from an 1840s survival manual mentions storing small coals in a metal container to transport between cabins, an early portable heater like a glowing lunch pail of survival. Some households even kept clay vessels of embers beneath their beds. One spark too fierce and the entire structure would ignite. But it was worth the danger to stay warm, to keep the fire nearby. You begin to understand the character of different firewood. The fast-burning tinder, the slow-burning hardwood. You recognise how long a piece will last, judging by its heft, the sound it makes when you knock it against the floor. You can sense in your gut how much longer the current supply will hold out. Fire becomes an extra sense. Something peculiar happens during these midnight shifts. Time expands. You think deeper. You remember faces, locations, moments you haven't allowed yourself to consider in weeks. You sit next to the fire and let your thoughts drift down frozen paths of memory, warmed just enough to continue. You compose letters in your mind, create stories you'll never share. You wonder what it would feel like to fall asleep and wake up somewhere warm just once without the burden of keeping everything from turning to ice. This is also when true solitude sets in. Even if you're not alone in the cabin, the night watch separates you. The others are wrapped in dreams, mumbling under layers of patched quilts. You stand guard over them like some wakeful protector, feeling the responsibility settle across your shoulders. The silence is too absolute. Sometimes you speak just to hear your own voice. You whisper to the fire like an old companion. You ask it to hang on. You promise it more fuel if it just won't die. And then, dawn. Or what counts as dawn in this grey smudged season. The fire burns lower but steady. Your watch ends. You slip in beside the others, thankful for shared body heat, and drift into restless sleep that feels more like a pause than genuine rest. Historians debate how common fire watches were in early frontier homes. Some records suggest they were standard practice, especially in the harshest regions, while others claim most people simply built enormous fires and crossed their fingers. But given the sheer volume of chimney fires and frostbite cases in the 1800s, it's reasonable to assume plenty of folks didn't keep watch, and some never woke up. There's one clever technique you discovered in an old diary. The ember pot, a small clay vessel lined with ash designed to hold a live coal overnight. Placed near the fire, it could be used to restart flames in the morning without flint or matches. It's brilliant. You craft one yourself, shaping clay with numb fingers, drying it beside the fire for days. It splits the first time you try it, but still holds a coal long enough to kindle a flame. You feel like a magician. The deeper the winter drags on, the more the night watch becomes your identity. You're no longer just someone attempting to survive. You're the guardian of the flame, the watchman, the final barrier between the living warmth of your cabin and the deadly frost beyond. Sure, you're worn out, your eyes are hollow, your muscles ache, your mind moves slowly, but when you sit in the light of that fire, listening to the wind beyond, watching the shadows shift, there's an odd kind of peace that settles in your chest. You're still breathing, still warm, still alive. You promised yourself you'd never allow it. You told yourself you'd draw a boundary somewhere, but here you are, still gazing across the dim, smoky room at a goat in your house, sharing your air, munching hay like it pays rent. And beside it, a chicken perched comfortably on a chair you used to occupy. It clucks quietly, then ruffles its feathers and drops something warm and wet onto the wooden floor. You exhale deeply. Welcome to the phase of winter where you invite the livestock indoors, because it's either them or the cold. And you're beginning to realise, sometimes survival means sharing your living space with a small judgmental farmyard. It begins with conscience. You hear them at night, your animals bleating, whimpering, shuffling in the cold. The wind slices through the flimsy walls of the shed like a knife. You convince yourself they'll manage. You constructed that shelter properly, didn't you? Then one morning you wake to discover the smallest of your goats lying rigid in the snow, eyes frozen open, and that settles it. You can't stand it. The following night you bring them inside. At first, it's temporary, an emergency measure, just until the weather breaks. You clear out a small space near the entrance, spread straw, even construct a makeshift barrier from boxes and broken furniture. The odour hits you right away. Warm, earthy, and unmistakably barn-like. But so does the heat, and suddenly you understand something crucial. Animals are furnaces, fluffy, hay-chomping, occasionally irritating furnaces. The goat remains, then the cow, the chickens as well. And somehow the pig ends up trotting inside during a particularly vicious ice storm. That one wasn't your decision. The pig chose for itself. And who are you to dispute a 200-pound mass of warmth and personality? You sleep wrapped in wool with a dog curled at your feet, chickens roosting above the fireplace and a cow snoring softly in the corner. It's mayhem. It's cramped. It smells like something between a petting zoo and a campfire. But it's toasty, and that's what counts. Historically, this wasn't uncommon. Many frontier families brought livestock inside during the harshest months, not from sentiment, but because animals meant survival. Milk, meat, eggs. Losing one to cold meant losing a food source. Some houses were constructed with animal shelters attached directly, sharing a wall with the main cabin to allow heat to flow through. Clever, if you overlook the stench. An amusing detail from an 1830s farm journal describes a family who insisted their chickens produced more eggs when kept inside during winter. Maybe it was the warmth, maybe it was the constant light from the fireplace, or maybe the chickens just enjoyed the companionship. Either way, eggs are eggs, and in January a fresh one is worth its weight in gold. At night you lie in bed listening to the orchestra of sounds. Grunts, clucks, gentle chewing, the occasional thump of a hoof against the floor. You adapt to sleeping through it. You even begin to find it soothing. The animals are like an additional layer of defence against the screaming wind outside. If they're breathing, if they're warm, if they're alive, then so are you. But let's be honest, it's not elegant. There's mud, there are droppings, there's the constant shuffling of animals trying to locate a comfortable spot that doesn't involve trampling your foot. You clean as well as you can, but you're burning through straw faster than anticipated. You attempt laying down pine needles, sawdust, whatever you can discover that soaks up the mess. It works temporarily. Then the smell accumulates gradually like a rising tide of ammonia and regret. You attempt to ventilate during the warmest hour of the day, cracking the door just enough to let in some fresh air without losing all your heat. The chickens interpret this as permission to escape. You chase them through snowbanks, barefoot and enraged, before surrendering and hauling them back in one by one, like feathered criminals. One evening, the cow sneezes directly into the fire. A blast of moist air sends a spray of ash across the room, and you just sit there, blinking, covered in soot. There's a moment of quiet. Then the goat bleats, as if chuckling. And yet it's difficult not to grow fond of them. You begin naming them, you chat with them during your night shift. The pig stares at you like it knows your secrets. The dog becomes your shadow. The chickens, well, they still despise you. That's just chickens. Scholars have argued for years whether this practice, bringing animals inside, was a calculated survival strategy or a desperate last resort. Some maintain it was intelligent adaptation. Others say it demonstrated just how unprepared settlers were for genuine winter. But you don't have time for theories. You have a chicken on your bed and a cow that's gnawing the handle of your axe. This is your reality now. A few families even went further, constructing true dual-purpose structures. Part barn, part home. The heat from the animals was integrated right into the design. And yes, that brought risks. Parasites, illness. One wrong kick and your firewood pile becomes kindling for a barn fire. But it kept people breathing. And in the depths of February, you begin to understand that the line between brilliant and insane isn't as clear as you once believed. The psychological change is genuine too. Initially, sharing space with animals feels like defeat, like civilization has stepped backward. But slowly, something else emerges. A rhythm, a sense of vitality. The animals become part of your routine, your conversations, your ecosystem. You stop thinking of them as guests and start thinking of them as housemates, stubborn, messy and occasionally noisy ones. Then one morning you wake up and it's silent. The snow has stopped, the sun is attempting to peek over the horizon. You step outside just to look and realize something wonderful and slightly terrifying. The cold snap's broken, just a little, but enough. You turn around to tell someone, anyone, and realize the pig is now occupying your chair watching you. You sigh. You go back inside and you let them stay just one more night. By this point, the outside world is more concept than reality. You haven't seen bare ground in weeks. Just a solid blanket of white that extends past the tree line and over the hills like the landscape's been erased. Your windows are sealed with frost. And when you open the door, it requires real force, like pushing against winter's spine. So you don't venture out unless you absolutely must. And when you do, it's always the same urgent reason. Food. You're no longer cooking to please anyone. You're not even cooking for enjoyment. You're cooking to stay alive. Every meal is a supply check. You've tallied everything countless times. What remains of the cornmeal, the dried beans, that one pitiful sack of flour clinging to the final scoop. You've developed an unsettling sixth sense for portion management. You can stretch a stew with just 2 potatoes and a prayer. The root cellar is your reluctant treasure vault. Cold, dark, and perpetually smelling of damp earth and gradual rot. Root cellars are a frontier essential, and now you grasp why. Carved into hillsides or built beneath the cabin, they use the earth's natural insulation to keep things just above freezing. Cold enough to preserve, warm enough to prevent freezing solid. Yours is small, tight, and lined with shelves stacked with jars and bowls. Burlap sacks, some full, some alarmingly light. You descend the steps like a prospector, hoping the gold vein hasn't dried up. Down there, time feels different. You run your hands over dusty jars of pickled cabbage, beets, and the final few precious peaches preserved in syrup. A miracle from back in August, now transformed into something sacred. You ration them. A spoonful here, a slice there. A small reminder that once the sun existed. There's something that gnaws at you during these food runs. The constant awareness that everything has limits. Every time you open a jar, empty a sack, or finish off a loaf, the weight of it strikes you. That was it. There's no more unless you create more. And winter doesn't care about your good intentions. You become a food wizard. You combine things that should never meet. You mash turnips into paste and call it porridge. You boil old ham bones until the marrow drips out like glue and pretend it's soup. You throw dried beans and salt into a pot and let it bubble for hours until it becomes something thick and edible. If it sticks to the spoon and doesn't smell like failure, it qualifies as dinner. A curious recipe you attempt comes from a worn frontier manual. Bread soup. You take stale bread, pour hot water over it, add a pinch of salt and stir until it stops looking pathetic. It tastes like wet disappointment, but it's warm, and that's what matters. Some settlers added wild herbs or dried berries if they had any. You once discovered a single withered blackberry in a jar and added it to a pot of rice. It dissolved instantly, but for a brief moment your stew was purple and smelled like hope. You begin inventing names for dishes. Mystery stew, last Tuesday's surprise. Maybe don't ask. It helps. It keeps spirits up when everyone's chewing something that may or may not have started life as jerky. You learn that humour is seasoning, so is deception. Then there are the moments when you have to dig deeper, literally. You haul up frozen carrots that have gone soft and clear. You scrape mould off stored apples and cut around the decay. You find a sack of potatoes that smells just wrong enough to give you pause, and you eat them anyway. Because hunger defeats hesitation. Historians still argue about the real extent of food shortages on the frontier. Some claim most families had enough preserved to last through. Others contend that lean winters were typical, not exceptional, and that hunger was a quiet, steady companion for months at a time. Based on your current diet, you're leaning toward the second theory. There's an old settler diary that mentions a man who boiled leather to make shoe stew. He softened strips of rawhide in water until they were chewable, claimed it worked as long as you didn't mind the taste of boot. You haven't reached that point yet, but you did catch yourself staring at a dried-out squirrel hide once, wondering how desperate things would need to get. And it's not just about the food you possess, it's the food you lack. Your cravings become merciless. One night you dream of butter melting on fresh cornbread. Another, it's roasted chicken with salt, pepper and rosemary. You wake up to a half-charred chunk of cornmeal mush and the sound of the pigs snoring by the hearth. Some days the hunger makes you adventurous. You strap on snowshoes, clumsy homemade contraptions lashed with rawhide and determination, and venture into the woods searching for anything edible. You dig through the snow to find frozen berries or strips of bark. You once boiled pine needles for tea. It tasted like Christmas and regret. Another time, you thought you spotted a rabbit trail, only to chase it into a drift and end up face first, snow in your collar, clutching a stick. Instead of dinner, you discover how much work food actually requires. How long it takes to grind corn by hand. How tedious it is to shell beans one at a time. You learn patience, or at least a low-level food-fueled rage disguised as patience. And yet, every now and then, you achieve a miracle. You boil beans and jerky, add just the right herbs, and it smells wonderful. People gather around the pot like it's a holy relic. You serve it in chipped bowls, and for 5 minutes everyone eats without speaking. The fire crackles, someone sighs, the dog licks the floor, and for a moment it's sufficient. Frontier survival isn't just fire and walls, It's nourishment, real nourishment. Even if it's awful, even if it's scavenged or scraped or made from the leftover flour stuck to the bottom of the barrel, it's warmth from the inside out. And that warmth, however brief, keeps you moving. So you scrape the pot, you lick the spoon, you save every crumb like it's currency. And when someone asks, "What's for breakfast tomorrow?" you smile and say, "Let's discover that together." It begins with a prickling, a numb patch on your fingertip that doesn't seem to wake up even when you press it against a mug of steaming tea. You dismiss it. Must have just slept on your hand oddly. Then it spreads. First your pinky, then your toes. Then the cold doesn't just sting anymore. It digs in, crawls deep, settles into your joints and challenges you to evict it. You've entered the phase of winter where the real adversary isn't the snow or the hunger, or even the monotony. It's your own body and what the cold intends to steal from it. Frostbite isn't a theatrical thing. Initially, it's sneaky, silent. You lose feeling in your fingers while hauling water, and then you stop worrying that you can't feel them. You forget to wear gloves for just 5 minutes, and that's all it requires. When your hands finally warm up again, they pulse with agony, like they've been set ablaze. It's a vicious irony. Getting warm hurts more than being cold. You don't discuss it much. Nobody wants to acknowledge it, but all of you are watching each other's ears, noses, toes. Looking for that pale, waxy appearance, that silent deadness. You conceal it when you can. Tape your fingers. Wear double socks. You wrap your feet in cloth at night and place them near the fire like damp kindling. But there's only so much you can accomplish. The socks are an entire saga by themselves. You own maybe 3 pairs. One is always damp, one is slightly less damp. The other is the holy grail, nearly dry, nearly warm, and therefore worn only on special occasions like Sunday or when your toes are threatening mutiny. You dry them on a line above the fire where they hang like little wool flags of defeat. If you're not careful, they scorch. If you're really not careful, they ignite. That's an entertaining way to explain to your housemates why their socks now resemble burnt pancakes. One desperate method you attempt out of sheer desperation involves putting warm ashes in a cloth pouch and tucking it into your boots. The concept is that the ashes stay warm and dry your feet while providing some insulation. It sort of works. It also sort of makes you feel like you're walking on a gritty, ashy mess. But you'll take that over frostbitten toes any day. And still, no matter what you attempt, your feet remain cold constantly. Even in bed. Even wrapped in wool and tucked near the fire, they ache like you've walked barefoot across a glacier. You develop a routine of massaging them each night, muttering curses under your breath like some kind of frost-footed sorcerer. You don't even care who observes anymore. Then come the chilblains, those strange, itchy red patches that blossom across your hands and feet like angry frost flowers. You scratch until you bleed, then wrap them in cloth soaked in vinegar or pine tea or whatever remedy someone swears worked for their cousin's uncle's friend. Nothing helps. You scratch, you bleed, you haul wood anyway. You recall reading once that Napoleon lost more soldiers to cold than to battle during his Russian campaign. You think of that now, carrying water with fingers that feel like porcelain. You don't need a battlefield for frostbite, just an ungloved moment outside the cabin. There's one terrifying moment when you pull off a boot and notice your toe looks different, pale, shiny, like wax. You press it. It doesn't react. Panic rises, but you swallow it. You soak it in warm, not hot water. That's the rule. Warm is safe, hot is dangerous. You feel the sensation return slowly, like a beast awakening from hibernation. It hurts so badly you nearly scream. But you don't because pain means it's still alive. Frostbite isn't the only thing you're avoiding. There's hypothermia too, the slow, sneaky drop in body temperature that makes people act strange, confused, clumsy, sometimes even cheerful. That's the frightening part. It can make you feel warm right before you freeze. You keep watch over each other. If someone starts removing clothes or wandering outside in the snow without boots, that's the warning sign. There's a story from a settler diary, maybe true, maybe embellished, about a man who got lost during a blizzard and was found the next morning sitting peacefully under a tree, coat off, smiling. He said he was waiting for summer. You never forget that little story. It becomes a caution. You remind yourself real cold doesn't feel cold. Real cold feels like giving up. And sometimes your cabin isn't much better. The fire doesn't reach every corner. There are pockets of cold that seem to exist just to taunt you. You move your bed closer to the hearth. You attempt to seal the cracks with more moss, more cloth, more whatever. Still, you wake up to frost on the inside of the walls. On the inside. That's when the fear really takes hold. Not loud, not panicked, just a quiet dread in your stomach. The realization that this winter doesn't want to be survived. It wants to take something. A finger, a toe, a foot. It doesn't care. It just wants less of you than there was before. And that makes you fight harder. You rotate your socks religiously. You never go outside without checking your gear twice. You drink warm tea even when it tastes like boiled tree bark. You share body heat when necessary, huddling under blankets, passing the dog around like a furry space heater. You build up the fire again and again like a challenge to the cold. Scholars still debate about how much frostbite actually occurred on the frontier. Medical records were sparse. People didn't always report it. Sometimes they just lived with the damage. Blackened toes, stiff fingers, limps that never disappeared. But you believe the worst stories now. You're living evidence of how easy it is to fall behind on body maintenance when your entire existence revolves around staying one step ahead of freezing to death. And yet somehow, you're still here. All 10 fingers, all 10 toes. Your feet are numb. They've been numb so long you've stopped checking them every few minutes, though you still wiggle your toes inside your boots just to make sure they're still attached. In a winter this brutal, keeping all 10 digits counts as winning. So here you are, huddled by the flames, legs stretched toward whatever warmth you can steal. You've made a promise to yourself. They can strip away your boots, peel off your socks, but those toes are staying put. Your vision has adapted to this perpetual twilight like you've sprouted bat wings, and you've mapped every weird shadow the firelight throws across these walls. But there's something missing. Something that should be letting actual sunlight pour through these walls. Here's what nobody mentions when you're planning your frontier dream cabin. Glass costs a fortune. A genuine, wallet-emptying fortune. If you didn't haul window panes from back east, congratulations. What you've got aren't windows, they're gaps. And gaps in walls are basically invitations for winter to come inside and make itself comfortable. During this record-breaking freeze, you figured you'd manage somehow. Maybe stretch some animal hide across the openings, tack up some paper. Sure, it might block the wind from carving up your face, but let's be realistic. It's not keeping anything warm, not even close. When that weak sun finally drags itself above the horizon for its brief grudging appearance, barely any light seeps through your improvised coverings. The whole place stays murky, dim, lit only by your fire and whatever pathetic candles you can afford. You never realised how much you'd miss real windows, miss being able to peek outside without actually going outside, miss reading the time of day by how the light falls across the floor. Now you're guessing based on how low the fire's burning, how long the shadows stretch, and whether your stomach's started its next round of complaining. Your internal clock is completely scrambled. Even proper glass windows wouldn't help much out here in this frozen wasteland. They'd fog over in seconds, and every breath you take would stick to them and freeze solid. Settlers wrote about scraping frost off the inside of their windows thick as wagon wheels every single morning. Others skipped windows entirely, cutting smaller holes and covering them with oil paper, sort of see-through, waterproofed, and completely useless for keeping heat inside. You gave that a shot. It failed miserably. Now that opening is just stuffed with firewood scraps, and you pretend it was never meant to be a window anyway. The choice is crystal clear. Do you want a view, or do you want to live through this? You pick warmth every single time, which turns your cabin into something closer to a cave than a home. Door sealed tight, fire crackling, it's almost cozy in a desperate sort of way. But when afternoon arrives with its endless grey sky and your room's corners disappear into thick shadows, something starts pressing down on you. All this darkness closing in. It's not suffocation of breath, it's suffocation of hope. Frontier folks whispered about something they called cabin fever. Not the restless kind where you pace around feeling antsy. This was something deeper, more sinister. Creeping anxiety, paranoia, black despair. Too many hours trapped inside, too much darkness, too little connection to anything beyond these walls. Some claimed it drove people mad, others said it made them vanish entirely. You brushed it off at first, but when days melt into each other and you can't remember the last time you saw actual sunlight, you start wondering if maybe they weren't just telling stories. You're trying to manufacture light with whatever you've got, mostly candles, rough, lumpy tallow ones made from animal fat and desperate hope. They smoke like factory chimneys and smell like a butcher shop, but they get the job done, sort of. You position them on shelves, on metal plates, anywhere that won't burn the place down, but they disappear fast and your supply isn't endless. You ration them like food, light one when you absolutely must see something, snuff it out the second you're finished. Your life becomes a rhythm of strike, squint, snuff. There's this fascinating tidbit you discovered in a borrowed almanac. Some early settlers crafted oil lamps from hollowed stones or metal cups, filling them with rendered fat and using rags as wicks. You attempted it once. Technically functional. Also made your cabin smell like someone deep-fried roadkill. You keep it around for true emergencies. Strange how you never thought of light as something you could run out of before. It just existed, arrived with dawn, departed at dusk. Now it's something you guard jealously, something you hoard like gold. You catch yourself moving like a blind person in the dark, bumping into walls, stepping on things, recently the chicken, and swearing at every piece of furniture like it personally insulted your mother. Historians debate whether windowless frontier cabins were truly necessary or just bad planning. Some argue pure practicality. Glass was too fragile and expensive, and wall openings meant drafts, and drafts meant death. Others think it was psychological, a barrier against the endless wilderness pressing in from all sides. You suspect both theories are right. You've developed a genuine fear of what might be lurking beyond these walls. Coyotes, wolves, or something worse. Complete silence. Sound becomes magnified in a windowless cabin. Every log creak, every fire snap echoes louder, more immediate. When wind howls, it fills every corner of the room. You've started recognizing specific groans in the cabin walls. One sounds like sighing, another like footsteps. You tell yourself it's just wood settling. You tell yourself lots of things these days. The indoor darkness messes with your head too, makes remembering things harder. You forget what day it is, what month it might be. You jump at shadows more easily, lose track of where you put things. You spent an entire hour hunting for your mittens while wearing them. When it happens, you laugh, not because it's funny, but because the alternative is probably crying. To fight back the darkness, you rearrange everything. Trying to bounce light around using tin plates and metal scraps positioned near the fire. It helps a tiny bit. You hang white cloth behind candles, polish lantern glass until it's crystal clear. You do everything except punch a hole in the wall and invite the wind inside, because that would defeat the whole purpose of staying alive. Sometimes you dream about windows, not just glass ones, but massive ones with curtains, with golden sunlight streaming through in warm shafts. The kind you saw in books or maybe once in some town back east. You dream about sitting beside one, sipping something hot, watching birds flutter past without worrying about your toes turning black and falling off. Then you wake up, light a smoky tallow candle and watch your breath curl through the dim light like a ghost. No windows here, just walls, just firelight, just you. But you're breathing, even in all this darkness. Sleep doesn't come easy when it's this cold, but eventually your body gives up caring. Exhaustion wins the battle. You burrow under a mountain of everything you own, blankets, coats, maybe the dog if it'll stay put, and drift off in fits and starts. When you do sleep, it's heavy, like being buried alive in wool and smoke. But the cold still creeps in, finding your feet, your fingers, your face. So you get creative, or desperate, depending on how you look at it. Time for one of the oldest tricks in the Frozen Survivor's Handbook, hot rocks. You've probably heard about this. Heat smooth stones in the fire, wrap them in something that won't burst into flames and tuck them into your bed to fight off the bitter night. Sounds charming, almost quaint, like something a storybook grandmother might do. But when you're the one hauling blazing rocks out of the hearth with makeshift tongs, you quickly realise there's nothing elegant about this process. It's practical and mildly terrifying. The rocks hiss when they hit the floor, still glowing faintly orange around the edges. You wrap them in thick cloth, usually whatever's least smoky or stained with unidentifiable animal fluids, then carefully slide them under your quilt. One wrong move and you've got a scorched mattress or a fresh scar shaped like a river stone. But done right, it's magnificent, like climbing into a bed that already has a pulse. The heat radiates slowly, deep and steady, wrapping around your legs and whispering that just for tonight, you don't have to shiver. The fire might die down, but those rocks keep working hours after you've fallen asleep. Of course there are complications. The heat doesn't last forever. After 2 or 3 hours, the rocks go cold and start stealing heat from your body. Now you've got a choice: stay put and deal with the chill, or crawl back into the dark and reheat your primitive bedroom furnace. Usually the cold wins. You kick off blankets, grumble your way out of bed, and start the whole awkward process again, trying not to step on anything left behind by the pig who's decided your mattress is the warmest spot in the entire cabin. There's an old settler trick involving heating bricks instead of rocks. Bricks supposedly hold heat longer and more evenly, assuming you're fancy enough to own bricks, which you're not. You've got river stones, pulled from the creek bed back in October, dried by the fire ever since. They're smooth, solid, and occasionally explode if you get them too hot. Yes, that happens. Note the small crater in the cabin wall. You also experiment with heating water bottles of sorts, metal flasks filled with hot liquid, sealed tight, wrapped in cloth and positioned at your feet. It works to a point, but it's risky. If one leaks, you're sleeping in a puddle, and out here, sleeping in a puddle is just asking to lose body parts you'd prefer to keep. The challenge with bed warming methods is balancing heat with safety, and both are constantly working against each other. You want the rock hot enough to feel like a miniature sun, but not so hot you wake up screaming. You want it close enough to radiate warmth, but far enough to avoid second-degree burns. If you're sharing a bed with someone, good luck navigating that minefield. There's always that moment when someone rolls onto the rock and makes a sound that definitely isn't sleep-related. Still, you make it work because it does work. Out here, function beats comfort every single time. Some families took the hot rock concept further. They dig shallow pits near the hearth, line them with stones, heat them all day, then move bedding over them at night. Instant floor heating. Others, especially those with more resources, built masonry beds with compartments underneath for filling with embers. Basically prototype radiant heating. Brilliant, and completely beyond your capabilities. There's even one documented case, unusual but real, of a family using heated sand. They kept a metal tray by the fire, filled it with dry sand, warmed it throughout the day, then at night poured the hot sand into cloth bags for sleeping companions. You read about that and think it's clever. Also wonder where in this frozen wasteland you'd find dry sand. You notice the dog understands the system. You heat a rock, place it at the bed's foot, and suddenly the dog's curled around it like it's discovered the secret to eternal happiness. Smart animal, you let it stay. The fire remains your primary heat source naturally, but it's not always sufficient. Not when wind howls, snow piles high, and frost creeps across interior walls like some slow-moving glacier with a personal grudge. So you embrace the rocks. You stack them near the fire during daylight hours, rotating them like you're operating a one-person pizza oven. You get skilled at testing temperature with a quick palm tap, fast enough to avoid blisters, long enough to judge readiness. Sometimes you wonder how people survived without these techniques. How many froze simply because nobody taught them a heated stone could be their salvation. Then you remember they didn't all make it. That's the part the stories skip over. Not every settler survived. Some built fires too small, used wood too green, went to sleep thinking they'd wake up and never did. That thought haunts you, especially on nights when you lie in bed with your feet pressed against fading warmth, listening to the fire die and wind rise. You pull blankets tighter, draw the dog closer, rest your heel against the stone wrapped in a torn towel. You might not have windows or fresh food or dry socks, but you have this, a hot rock in a cold bed. Sometimes that's enough to keep going. Darkness doesn't just arrive. It settles thick and absolute, swallowing your cabin like ink in water. Once the sun vanishes, and honestly you're not sure it appeared today, your entire world shrinks to the small circle of flickering flame light. Every night, that circle gets smaller. Why? Because you're running out of candles, and that means you're running out of light. When the tallow supply runs low, you feel it behind your eyes, not in your stomach like hunger, but as a dull ache when you squint at the floor trying to locate your boot in the gloom, or when you bump into the stove and curse the fact that you can't afford to burn an extra wick. It's a new type of rationing illumination itself. Your supply started out decent. Candles you brought along, packed in boxes and tins, carefully wrapped to prevent melting in autumn heat. You even had quality ones initially. Beeswax, believe it or not. Smooth, golden, faintly sweet smelling. They burned clean without stench or smoke. You protected them like treasure. Then winter hit hard and the good ones disappeared fast. You tried using them sparingly for reading, sewing, writing letters. But eventually all that remained was tallow, the poor person's candle. Tallow comes from animal fat, rendered until it's thick and waxy, poured into moulds or hand-dipped around wicks that barely hold their shape. It smells exactly like what it is, cooked grease. Light one and your cabin fills with the aroma of a butcher's workspace. Not pleasant, but out here, pleasant died sometime in November. Making them requires an entire ritual. You melt fat slowly, skimming off anything questionable. You strain it through cloth while trying not to gag, then pour it into whatever containers you can find. Old tins, hollowed bones, even shells work if you're feeling resourceful. You drop in twine or rag scraps as wicks, let everything cool, and hope it holds together long enough to burn for more than 10 minutes. If you're lucky, you have proper cotton wicks, tightly wound and slow burning. If not, you improvise. Once you braided strands from your own shirt and dipped them in wax. Sort of worked. The flame danced like it was intoxicated and spattered tallow across the table, but it provided 15 minutes of light, which felt luxurious. Candle rationing becomes critical survival strategy. You learn quickly that wasting tallow ranks right up there with wasting food. It burns too fast if you leave one lit unnecessarily. While eating, walking, just thinking out loud, you're basically tossing part of your survival plan into the flames. So you stop lighting candles just because it's dark. Now you light one only when absolutely necessary. Cooking dinner maybe. Reading a letter from home. Okay. Staring blankly at walls while questioning every life choice that brought you here. Nope. Do that in the dark. Some frontier families avoided candles entirely, relying on firelight alone or grease lamps made from whatever scrap metal they could bend into shape. There's an interesting method in an old pioneer guide involving burning pine knots, which are rich in sap and flare brightly when ignited. You attempted it once. Smoked like a factory chimney and filled the room with the scent of a burning Christmas tree. But it was bright. There's even a theory that some families used ice windows, thin sheets of frozen water placed in frames to allow daylight inside during winter days. Sounds incredible, probably mythology. But there's something poetic about using the very thing trying to kill you to see a little more clearly. The real problem emerges when you need both hands free. Cooking, mending, anything involving tools requires light, but you don't have lantern oil. You end up tying candles to sticks, holding them in your mouth or balancing them on shelves while working in the wavering cone of flickering illumination. It's dangerous. You burn yourself regularly, singe your hair. One night a candle tips onto your only decent gloves and you spend the following week scraping hardened tallow off the fingers while muttering curses. Eventually your candles grow shorter. You remelt the stubs, combining them into Frankenstein candles with twisted wicks and lumpy sides. They burn crooked, but you learn to rotate them slowly, like roasting marshmallows, so one side doesn't collapse before the other. You start scheduling life around available light. Wake with the sun or what passes for it. Accomplish everything possible before dark, then retreat to the fire. You read less, write even less. Not worth the candle, as they say. The darkness expands. Not just in the room, but in your thoughts. Without light, the cabin feels smaller, walls closer. You become hyper-aware of every creak, every spark from the fire, every breath from animals tucked in the corner. Shadows stretch long and whisper thin, playing tricks on your mind. You see things, or think you do. There's a moment late one night when you swear you detect movement outside, just a flicker in peripheral vision. You grab your coat, step outside with your last good candle, hold it up like a shield. The flame sputters in wind, casting wild shapes on snowbanks. Nothing there, just wind and nerves. You return inside and let the candle burn completely down without trying to save it. You needed that light, needed that small victory against the darkness. Scholars debate how psychologically damaging long winters were for frontier settlers. Some claim people adapted to darkness better then, that they were accustomed to early nights and extended rest periods. Others suggest light deprivation led to depression spikes, cabin fever, even hallucinations. You don't need academic debates. You're living the answer. Still, there's power in a single flame. Even now, even here, you strike flint, catch the spark, and when that wick ignites, the entire room feels marginally less oppressive. Shadows retreat, cold eases slightly, and you can see your own hands again. You protect that flame, like your existence depends on it, because sometimes it absolutely does. Time stops moving in days and starts moving in storms, in firewood loads, in remaining candles, in how many meals you can stretch from one withered onion. Somewhere along the way you quit noticing when days get darker and start noticing when you do. You're different now. Slower, more cautious, and maybe slightly cracked around the edges. The truth is, you've been trapped inside too long. This cabin has become your universe. 10 steps in any direction hits a wall. You can trace every knot in every log, know exactly where floorboards creak near the door, predict the fire's rhythm before it flares. It's familiarity bordering on obsession. You're not just living in the cabin anymore, you've merged with it. You are the cabin, but your mind floats somewhere else entirely, drifting and flickering, gnawing on its own thoughts like a caged animal. Silence gets to you, especially at night when the fire dies low and even wind seems too exhausted to howl. You think you hear things, scraping, whispering, soft impacts. Probably the animals, probably imagination, but you check anyway, every single time. You talk to yourself more now. Not full conversations yet, but murmured observations, muttered complaints, little comments nobody else should hear. You tell the fire it's performing well. Scold the walls for allowing drafts. Say thank you when your boots finally thaw. By morning, you don't even realise you're doing it until someone catches you. And by someone, you mean the pig, who gives you a look that clearly says, "This is why I sleep in your chair." There's a term for it, winter madness, or if you're feeling dramatic, going squirrely. The condition where isolation, darkness, hunger, and relentless cold start peeling away sanity layers like an onion. It happened to mountain men, Arctic explorers, ordinary families who simply couldn't endure one more day staring at identical walls. There are accounts of people hallucinating, screaming at wind, even abandoning homes mid-blizzard because they thought they heard voices calling from outside. One story from a Montana settler in the 1870s tells of a man who insisted he saw people dancing in snow every night. Neighbours found him barefoot in a drift, smiling, convinced he was at a party. He lost 3 toes, never discussed it again. You read that story once, thought it was ridiculous. Now it sounds entirely plausible. You're not there yet, but you can feel the slope beneath your feet. To fight back, you try creating structure. A schedule. Morning firewood and water, midday cooking something, afternoon mending something, evening fire tending and pretending to read. It helps slightly, the illusion of control. But days blur regardless. You find yourself staring at the same book page for an hour, reading the same sentence 3 times without remembering what it said. Sometimes you write things down. Little notes to yourself, lists, observations, dream fragments. Not because they matter, but because it reminds you that you exist outside your own head. When you read them later, they barely make sense. One note says, goats are suspiciously good at climbing stairs. Another just says, Thursday, with a question mark. You don't remember writing that one. The worst moments come when you try sleeping. That's when your mind decides to unravel like dropped yarn. You think about everything simultaneously. Home, people you miss, food you'll never taste again, the sound of rain instead of snow. You think about warm sand, green grass, light through actual glass windows. Your body shivers even though the bed is warm, and you realise it's not from cold. Some days you don't want to get up. Fire's low, cabin's dark. You lie there under blankets, just listening, to creaks, to wind, to your own heartbeat drumming against silence. You tell yourself it's okay to rest, but really you're avoiding the day because once you're up, it's the same routine, same food, same 10 steps in any direction. Yet there are tricks and small things to grasp onto. You clean things that don't need cleaning just to give your hands purpose. You reorganise shelves for the 10th time, sharpen knives unused for weeks, mend clothes that aren't torn. You braid leftover cloth strips into ropes just to see how long they'll grow. You hum songs you can't remember learning. Hum until the sound fills enough space that silence can't push back in. There's an old belief that whistling in cabins at night invites spirits. You don't whistle, not because you believe it, but well, just in case. One fascinating account from an 1830s diary describes a woman making dolls from straw and moss to keep herself company through winter. She gave them names, voices, braided their hair. Neighbours called her odd, but she survived 5 straight winters in a cabin smaller than yours. Maybe odd is a reasonable price to pay. Scholars argue about how much frontier madness was environmental versus psychological. Was it the cold, lack of sunlight, constant survival stress? Or just sheer loneliness, being cut off from the world, from variety, from stimulation? Probably all of it played a role. But you don't need theories. You feel it in your bones. You've started counting logs needed to boil water, memorized floorboard knots, can tell time by wind volume. Sometimes when you wake at night, you forget where you are for a split second and think maybe this was all a mistake. But then morning comes, or what passes for it. You get up, light the fire, brew pine needle tea, stretch your arms and shake weird dreams from your head. You do it all again. You're not losing your mind, not completely, just brushing against the edges. That's what winter does. But the trick isn't staying sane. It's staying here, holding on to yourself, even if it's by threads of your mittens and echoes of your own voice in an empty room. So you take a deep breath, whisper something to the fire, remind yourself you're still real, and keep going. Some nights, when wind dies and cabin walls stop groaning, you reach for the bottle. Not proudly, not even intentionally at first. It's just there, tucked behind the flour sack or wedged under cloth bundles. You tell yourself it's for emergencies, for disinfecting wounds, for trading. But then comes a night so bitter, so bone-deep cold, that logic steps aside and you tell yourself just a sip for warmth. In that moment, whiskey feels like salvation. The first swallow burns like fire. Good, that's the point. It spreads through your chest like a thaw, false sunshine pushing warmth into your body's frozen edges. For a few precious minutes you almost feel human again. Cold retreats, muscles unclench, the world softens. Fire glows brighter. Shadows lean away. You might even smile. But it never lasts. What feels like heat is just a trick, false signals from dilating blood vessels. Your core temperature doesn't rise, it drops. Alcohol sends warmth to your skin, not your organs. You're not heating up, you're hemorrhaging heat like a broken stove. By the time the buzz wears off, your fingers are colder than before. Your breath comes in shallow bursts, and the cabin feels 50 degrees colder than it did an hour ago. You understand the warnings, the cautionary tales, but understanding and feeling are different things when your bones ache from cold and your woodpile has shrunk to twigs and wishful thinking. So yes, sometimes you drink, and you're far from alone. Countless frontier families relied on spirits during the harsh months. Rum, gin, hard cider, sometimes pure grain spirits cut with whatever was available. It served as medicine, pain relief, numbing comfort, and occasional escape. Records from the 1800s mention whiskey tea as a daily ritual during fierce storms, a perilous ritual. More than one person froze in their bed clutching an empty flask. There's one dark story, perhaps legend, perhaps truth, about a hunter who attempted to stay warm during a blizzard by downing a full bottle of rum and burrowing into a snowbank. His reasoning: the freeze can't reach me if I'm beneath it. They discovered him 3 days later, perfectly intact, still gripping the empty vessel. It became a warning story you recall every time you're drawn to another drink, even carefully measured. The liquor transforms your evenings, makes your mind drift, makes the darkness shift. Once you swore you glimpsed someone seated beside the fireplace opposite you, just a brief illusion of light. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was how the liquor made the flames dance, made your vision blur, made your mind create forms that existed only in imagination. The boundary between solace and peril is razor thin in the bitter cold. Alcohol draws you nearer to the brink, but sometimes that brink resembles salvation. You sit there, bottle gripped tight, gazing into the flames and recalling warmer lands, beloved faces from home. Childhood dinners with laughter filling the air. You recognize it's a snare, but for one evening you allow yourself to descend into it. Then comes the shame. You awaken the following morning sluggish, cranky, parched as dust. The fire has dimmed, the cabin is arctic, You squandered valuable fuel while slumbering too deeply, deceived by the false warmth coursing through your veins. Your tongue feels like charcoal. You curse yourself softly while coaxing the fire back to life and heating water to banish the headache. You swear off the bottle once more. You grow more cautious with it afterward. You measure portions. You wait until the flames are strong. You drink only when you know someone else will maintain the fire. Or more frequently, not at all, but knowing it's there, just steps away, gnaws at you, not from craving it, but because you understand how easily one brutal night can drive you back to it. Historians still debate the cultural significance of alcohol on the frontier. Was it a survival tool? Evidence of despair? Social bonding? The reality is, it served all these purposes and more in isolation. It offered a shortcut to comfort, a brief escape from the relentless grind of frost and stillness. But the cost was enormous, and not everyone returned from that escape. There's an odd comfort in that initial burn, though. You cannot deny it. That sip of heat in a world of ice, that fleeting illusion of mastery, of dominance over something. For an instant, you feel like you're choosing to endure, not being dragged through survival by sheer will. You attempt replacing it with ceremonies, a mug of hot tea, a melody hummed quietly, a page from a book, something that anchors you, something that doesn't steal your clarity. You construct new patterns. You reserve the bottle for genuine crises, wounds, trauma, or bartering. And you maintain your distance mostly. One evening, you pour the final drops of whiskey into a metal cup, warm it gently beside the fire, and lift it in a silent toast to your flames, to your frozen boots, to the hen who finally produced an egg after 3 weeks of theatrical pouting. You sip deliberately, just one taste. You relish it. You let the warmth spread, then fade, and when the cup sits empty, you set it aside and retire to bed completely sober. Because the truth is, warmth doesn't flow from the bottle. It flows from the struggle, from rising in the dead of night to add another log to the flames, from wrapping your fingers around a heated stone, from moving even when you resist. It flows from choosing repeatedly to remain in your own thoughts, even when the darkness wants to claim them. And ultimately, that's more powerful than whiskey. It's deep winter, and every meal now resembles a science experiment, held together by desperation and reckless culinary hope. You're not preparing food anymore. You're conducting frontier kitchen wizardry. You stir pots like a sorcerer with a limited recipe collection and questionable supplies. What remains in the cabin could barely fill a picnic basket, and yet you succeed daily in creating something remotely edible and miraculously just short of toxic. The larder, what little exists, resembles the most pitiful trading post in recorded history. A partial bag of flour that smells slightly stale but hasn't sprouted legs yet. Several jars of pickled mystery you've stopped questioning. What vegetables? So many legumes. Dried, soaked, mashed and reimagined in more variations than you wish to acknowledge. There's still some salt, thank heaven, and a few herbs you collected months ago, now brittle and tasteless, but useful for the pretense of diversity. Your culinary approach now consists of 3 categories: soup, thicker soup, and bread-like substance. Every dish starts identically: water, heat, hope. You add legumes, perhaps a sliver of preserved meat if you're feeling wealthy. Some onions, if you still possess them, though by now they've grown soft and strangely sweet. You boil until everything softens into one lumpy consistency. Then you christen it. Something fanciful, Hunter's Fortune, Wagon Wheel Wonder, or your personal favourite, Mystery Number 7. That last creation was mostly turnip broth and ground acorn flour, but for 5 minutes it actually resembled something genuine. You learn to value texture over flavour. A bit of chewiness is a triumph for crunch that isn't from an insect, pure luxury. One evening you discover an entire garlic bulb hiding in your supplies like a secret treasure from fate. You nearly weep. You use it sparingly, shaving pieces into 3 separate meals like it's the sacred grail of taste. Garlic becomes your new precious currency. There's a satisfaction, strange but genuine, in taking worthless ingredients and creating something nearly delectable. You begin roasting things just to experiment. You dry vegetable skins and transform them into snacks. You even discover how to make something resembling a cracker, which means you bake mush until it hardens and flattens. Does it taste pleasant? Absolutely not. But it's crispy, and that counts for something. Preserved meat appears regularly on the menu, and preserved covers a broad range. Some is salted beyond recognition, essentially edible leather. Others are smoked jerky, tough and chewy, yet surprisingly filling. After sufficient gnawing, the worst piece you ever consumed had to be soaked in water for 2 hours before it stopped tasting like barrel wood. You still consumed it. You still called it supper. And let's not overlook the magical moments when you uncover an ingredient you forgot you possessed. Like when you pulled out a container from the back of the shelf, assuming it contained pickles, and discovered molasses. Thick, dark, magnificent molasses. You added a spoonful to your cornbread that evening, and it tasted like dessert. Genuine dessert. You nearly offered some to the hog in celebration and then reconsidered. That hog's already arrogant enough. But not everything succeeds. Some meals are catastrophes. Once you added dried dandelion greens to a stew, and everyone in the cabin refused to eat for an entire day. Another time, you attempted to make coffee from roasted chicory root and ground acorns. It tasted like charred tree bark steeped in disappointment. You still drank it twice. There's an ancient recipe passed from settler to settler called slump. It's precisely what it sounds like. Stew with lumps of dough dropped in and boiled until they stop floating. It looks like misery and tastes like regret, but it satisfies you. And that's all anyone can expect from a meal in January. You've made slump more times than you care to remember, and at this point you've accepted it as family. A random fact you read once in a survival guide. Some pioneers made candy from boiled snow and maple syrup, letting it harden on a pan until it cracked like glass. It sounds mythical, something from a fairy tale. And then, one wonderful day, you recall that you still have a small jar of syrup left from autumn. You can boil it. You drizzle it on fresh snow. And there it is. Candy. Real candy. Sweet and crisp and surprisingly delicious. For a few minutes it's like being human again, but then the snow melts in your palm, the fire smokes excessively, and you're back to scraping the pot with a stick. Historians still debate just how creative frontier families became with food during winter. Some argue that their survival depended on strict rationing and simple meals. Just legumes and bread, day after day. Others point to the journals and oral histories that describe food innovation born from necessity. You fall firmly into the second group. No one survives a frontier winter without getting experimental in the kitchen. You make broths from bones, you bake ash into biscuits, you steal a chicken egg once weekly and divide it 4 ways. You once used pine needles in a stew and told everyone it was seasoned. They believed you. Your relationship with food transforms, becomes sacred. Not the food itself, really, but the act of preparing it, stirring the pot, inhaling the steam, watching it bubble. Even if it's identical to what you had yesterday and the day before, the ritual becomes an anchor to sanity, to routine, to the version of yourself that believes, deep down, you'll survive this. And when you serve the meal, no matter how unattractive, bland, or questionably textured, you do it with dignity, because it means you found a way one more time to nourish yourself and anyone trapped in this wooden box with you. That's not just food, that's survival with flavour. So you clean the bowls, you scrub the pot spotless, you wrap the last piece of cornbread in a cloth and save it for morning. You sit beside the fire, stomach partially full, and listen to the wind outside. Tomorrow you'll search through the larder again. You'll boil something odd. You'll invent a name for it, and you'll eat like you mean it. Because food out here is hope you can taste. You've adapted to plenty out here. The cold, the darkness, the endless stew rotations. But one thing you'll never quite adapt to is the terror of needing to urinate at 2 in the morning. Because on the frontier, bathroom means one thing: the outhouse. And the outhouse in the middle of winter is less of a convenience and more of a nightmare film location. When nature calls, you have two options: answer it or lie awake for the next 5 hours with your bladder screaming and your dignity in ruins. Most nights you try to delay, but some nights you simply cannot. The outhouse sits maybe 50 paces from the cabin, give or take. Far enough to be an expedition. Close enough to feel like a cruel prank. In the summer, it's tolerable. Smells odd, but it's bearable. In the winter, it's a gateway to a frozen underworld. You bundle up, steel yourself, and step into the night, boots crunching over hard-packed snow, every muscle in your body tensing tighter with each breath of brutal air. Sometimes the moon assists, casting everything in spectral light, at least providing enough vision to avoid tripping over the woodpile or stepping into a snowdrift. Other times it's pitch black and you're navigating by memory, instinct, and the occasional profanity. You carry a lantern when you can spare the oil. When you cannot, you stumble through the dark like a half-frozen raccoon on a mission. By the time you reach the outhouse door, your teeth are chattering and your hands have lost sensation. You push open the frozen plank, step inside, and are immediately greeted by a smell that even the dead of winter cannot entirely eliminate. It's not as severe as summer, but it's present, earthy, sharp, and somehow still warm in a place where nothing else is. You lower yourself carefully onto a frozen wooden seat, try to finish your business without touching anything, and mentally prepare for the dash back to the cabin. But then there's a noise. A low rustle, maybe a creak. You freeze, half from fear, half because your muscles have stopped cooperating. You hold your breath and listen. Could be wind, could be snow sliding off the roof, could also be something alive, something with fur and fangs and not nearly enough respect for personal space. You've heard the tales: bears prowling around in autumn, desperate for food, coyotes lurking through the woods at night, sniffing around for scraps, mountain lions, wolves, weasels with aggressive tendencies. All possibilities. There's even a local legend about a raccoon the size of a dog that lives near the creek and steals boots. You chuckle about it sometimes, but not out here, not now. You rush. You sprint back to the cabin with one boot half on and the other flapping. The door sticks. The lantern tumbles. You fumble with frozen fingers, wrench it open and slam it shut behind you, chest heaving, breath forming clouds as you curse the existence of every animal larger than a squirrel. The worst part? That wasn't even the most frightening night. That came a few weeks back when you opened the door and found fresh tracks in the snow, large ones, padded, not human. You followed them with your eyes as they led around the cabin up to the shed and disappeared behind a snowbank. No sign of struggle, no blood, no disturbance. Just prints, like something had been observing, listening, maybe waiting. You're not the only one to experience it. A diary entry from an 1842 homesteader describes waking to find her milk goat dead outside the outhouse, throat torn open, snow around it black with blood. No explanation, just terror. She wrote that her children refused to use the latrine alone. After that, you understand them perfectly. You try to get inventive. Digging out a night bucket and stashing it inside the cabin works fine for number 1. Number 2, not so much. And once the bucket freezes solid, you're back to braving the elements anyway. You build a small windbreak, add extra boards to the outhouse wall, even try insulating it with straw. It helps, but not enough. There's no such thing as a warm outhouse, only less terrible ones. And naturally, the animals don't help. The goat once followed you out in the dark and bleated so loudly you nearly wet yourself before you even reached the seat. The hog tried to wedge inside once, God knows why. Curiosity maybe, or the warmth. Chickens have taken to roosting on the path, and you've stepped on more feathers in the dark than you care to count. A fringe frontier trick you attempt, one you didn't believe until you were desperate, involves heating a flat rock near the fire and placing it on the outhouse seat. Sounds absurd, right? Until you try sitting on bare wood in sub-zero temperatures, that trick feels like the difference between survival and psychological collapse. You wonder how others managed it. Indigenous communities had smarter systems, warm pits, efficient shelters, not a box in the woods you have to sprint to like a terrified lunatic. You read once about trench latrines dug right outside the cabin for winter use. Easier access, if not exactly dignified. You consider it, then remember the smell in July and think better of it. But the fear lingers. Every time you step outside after midnight, you brace for it. A growl, a flash of movement, a set of glowing eyes just beyond the lantern's reach. Most nights it's nothing, just wind, just snow, just your own paranoia feeding itself in the dark. But some nights, something is out there, something real, something watching. You cannot prove it, but you know it in your bones, so you move faster. You keep a knife by the door. You teach yourself how to hold the lantern in your teeth while your hands are occupied. You prepare. Because out here, something as basic as using the bathroom has consequences. You used to joke about frontier life. Roughing it, you called it. Now you understand there's no roughing it out here. There's just surviving it, one trip to the outhouse at a time. You've abandoned caring about gold. Not that you had much to begin with, but whatever shine the idea of riches once held has long since faded under layers of frost and the stench of wet wool. Out here in the deep bone of winter, warmth is the only currency that counts. And there's one item that surpasses everything else. Fur. Thick, sturdy animal, wearable fur. Forget shiny stones or fancy paper money. If you want to survive a frontier winter, you better have something warm to wrap yourself in, or something worth trading for it. Your first encounter with the frontier fur economy probably came long before you needed it. Maybe you saw someone in town with a coat that looked like it came off a bear, still half alive. Maybe a trapper passing through tossed a bundle of pelts onto a counter and walked out with half the general store. Back then, it seemed odd. Now it makes perfect sense. Fur means heat. It means comfort. It means not dying, which makes it the most valuable thing you can carry. Once the snow starts banking against the cabin walls and your fingers start turning a disturbing shade of white, you remember your first trade for fur like it was yesterday. You were short on mittens. The last pair got too close to the fire and went up in a puff of smoke and harsh words. You had nothing else that would keep your hands from freezing off during wood chopping duty. So you hiked out to a neighbouring cabin, a trapper's shack that looked more beast than human. And you negotiated, gave him the last of your flour and half a bottle of cider. In return, you got a pair of beaver fur mittens that smelled like marsh and blood, but felt like paradise. They're still the warmest things you own. Frontier trading systems weren't polite, they were primitive. Everything was a negotiation, and everyone knew exactly what their goods were worth. Especially in winter. You could trade a rifle for a bearskin, a warm coat for a sack of salt. A single muskrat pelt might buy you a week of firewood, depending on how desperate someone was. And desperation was the standard, not the exception. There's a strange economics to it. The colder it gets, the more value fur seems to accumulate. You'd laugh if it weren't so accurate. Trappers understood this. They built their entire livelihood on fur, hauling in pelts by the armload, drying them in sheds, stacking them like lumber. Otter, beaver, fox, mink, even skunk if necessary. Though that last one came with its own brand of social consequences. One unusual report from an 1849 trading post describes a man who walked into a deal wearing nothing but a muskrat cape, a raccoon hat, and a necklace made of squirrel tails. He looked like a failed forest shaman, but he walked out with enough sugar, flour and molasses to last him a month, because function beats fashion every single time. There's also a certain hierarchy of furs. Beaver, prized for its density and waterproof quality. Muskrat, good for lining boots. Rabbit soft, but delicate. It works better in layers. Deer hides are useful for outer garments. tough and durable, but they don't insulate as well. Then there's buffalo if you're fortunate enough to have one. Wrap yourself in a buffalo robe and you'll sleep through the worst blizzard nature can deliver, snoring like it's summer. If you don't trap yourself, you trade. And if you do trap, then your entire world revolves around checking lines, keeping furs dry and hoping something hasn't chewed off its own leg to escape before you arrive. It's grim sometimes, but it's existence. You tried trapping once. Didn't go well. You baited a snare near the edge of the woods, proud of your knots, confident with anticipation. Returned 2 days later to find the trap empty and your bait gone. Next time you caught a rabbit. But the trap hadn't killed it, and the thing stared at you with such rage that you released it out of sheer guilt. After that, you stuck to trading. Fur also plays a psychological role. It feels safer. A fur collar pulled up against your ears is more than insulation. It's armour. It's reassurance. It's the difference between walking into a storm and curling up like a frightened animal inside a hollow log. When you wear fur, you don't just survive. You face the cold like an equal. Of course, wearing fur means you look like a walking taxidermy display. You've got patches stitched onto patches, a beaver hat with fox ear flaps, mittens lined with who knows what, a scarf that might actually be a weasel. You don't ask questions anymore. You just wear whatever works, even if it smells like damp dog and has a tendency to shed into your soup. There's a practicality to all of it. You keep pelts hung near the fire to soften them. You brush out the fur with pine twigs. You learn how to sew rough hide with sinew and broken needles. You figure out what goes where. Thicker hides for blankets, thinner ones for linings, soft fur for insoles. You adapt. And when the traders do come through, wandering the winter roads with sleds piled high and eyes that look like they haven't blinked since November, you trade again. You swap firewood, preserved food or anything that hasn't frozen solid for a new pelt, a better lining, or a scrap large enough to patch the hole in your coat where the wind keeps finding your ribs. You stop thinking in dollars. You think in warmth units. Is this item worth 1 rabbit skin or 3? Would I give up my foxtail for that fur-lined cap? What's a dry, smoke-cured deer hide worth when you haven't had dry boots in 3 weeks? The answer, everything. And still there's one trade you'll never forget. A boy no more than 12 appears with a bundle of pelts wrapped in oilskin. Quiet kid, eyes like polished stone. He lays out 5 perfect fox hides, deep red, thick, beautiful. He points to your stew pot. You hesitate, then hand him the whole thing, full and steaming. He leaves without a word. You never see him again. But that night, you sleep with a fox pelt wrapped around your shoulders and your stomach full. In spring, maybe fur will return to being something fancy. A fashion statement, a symbol of wealth. But in winter, it's a matter of life and death. And out here, death has cold fingers. No patience. So you keep trading, keep sewing, keep wrapping yourself in warmth that once had a heartbeat. Because gold cannot keep you warm, but fur. Fur just might. Snow doesn't care if you're at war. That's the first lesson you learn when conflict meets winter. The cold doesn't pause for enemies, it doesn't retreat for strategy. Snow keeps coming down, relentless and uncaring about which army you support. But here on the edge of civilization, conflict finds you regardless, especially when the cold bites deep enough to freeze your breath before it escapes your throat. It begins with whispers. A horseman arrives, white with cold and terror, speaking of attacks upstream, a homestead torched before dawn, another property deserted, then violence, 2 men dead, 3 animals stolen, footprints disappearing into the forest. Suddenly your snow-blanketed dwelling isn't as isolated as you believed. There's no opportunity to absorb it. You were already struggling to survive the freeze. Now you must consider arms, protection, adversaries who move through snow better than you, who understand this territory better than you, who don't require flames to last the night. You begin resting uneasily. You hone implements meant for game but now seem designed for different purposes. You bring fuel wood indoors, not merely for warmth, but to barricade the entrance. Every timber grown, Every wind gust rattling the boards feels ominous. Like it could be footfalls, could be breathing, could be something beyond mere weather. Throughout history, cold season battles were uncommon but savage. Nature killed as frequently as any musket. A renowned colonial war diary describes troops with cloth-wrapped feet, bootless, trudging through drifts just to assault foes equally frozen and doubly wretched. Nobody triumphed, they simply survived. The borderland had its own battles, colonists fighting indigenous peoples, armed bands turning lawless, strikes conducted beneath snow's cover and stillness. You study reports of native fighters crossing icy streams in complete silence, their traces erased by falling powder before anyone could follow them. Hit-and-run methods, accuracy, swiftness. While your people just try not to perish from exposure, you aren't made for this. You were barely holding on and now you must watch the distance and guard the threshold. You keep your rifle nearer now. You prepare it nightly. Maintain it by flame light. Verify the powder, though frost makes the spark less dependable and your fingers too numb to shoot straight. You arrange tripwires with hollow cans tied to cord. You teach the hound to growl at phantoms, and you're uncertain if that's genuine training or just fear wrapped in animal fur. One evening you detect something beyond. Not weather, not precipitation. Something substantial. A snap, then another. You grab your weapon, pause. Stop breathing. The flames dance behind you. You wait longer than any person should endure. Wait, then silence. You crack the door slightly. Only the forest sighing in darkness. Perhaps a buck, perhaps not. You return inside and pile another timber against the entrance anyway. There's an instant in every frontier cold season when you understand the elements aren't your only threat. And unlike the snow, your enemy has purpose, strategy. Hands that can strike flame and ignite a storehouse, or worse. Seize what little you possess, what you spent seasons gathering and saving and guarding. You can outlast the weather. You might not outlast your fellow man. A tale from 1863 troubles you. A pioneer family near the Missouri frontier. Winter assault. House burned. No witnesses. Nobody knows which faction was responsible. Irregular troops, vengeful homesteaders, starving outlaws. In the freeze, distinctions between ally and foe blur and snow conceals all proof. And if it's not people, it's the danger of being trapped between them. A company of cavalry passing through seizing provisions. A roving group of deserters who don't request entry. You're cut off, defenceless. You lack the privilege of politics or banners. You have one allegiance, living. You begin concealing things for safety. Grain sack beneath the floor planks. Preserved meat hidden behind the fireplace stones. A backup blade wrapped in fabric and buried in the fuel pile. It seems suspicious, until it doesn't. The hound snarls more frequently, a deep worried sound like it senses the atmosphere has changed. You consider departing, maybe gathering what you can and heading toward the closest settlement, but it's 4 days through heavy powder. Deep drifts. With a dying mount and insufficient food, you'd be a moving mark or a frozen corpse. So you remain. You shelter in place and outlast whatever's approaching. An odd entry in an ancient militia record describes one settler woman who escaped a raiding party by boarding up her front entrance, building fires in several chambers, and positioning a decoy in the window to suggest her husband stood watch. They bypassed her dwelling. You grin at that? Might attempt it yourself. There's an aged jacket and extra cap. Fine idea. Historians debate how common winter violence truly was. Some claim it was unusual. Cold weather prevented most conflicts. Others maintain it was ideal for surprise attacks. No fields to tend, nobody expecting trouble, everyone huddled indoors like game. You're beginning to favour the latter view, because when the tapping finally arrives, gentle, measured and definitely not. Wind. You sense it in your backbone. You don't respond immediately. You wait, palm on the wood, breath suspended, listening. Another tap, slower, firmer. You take the gun, open the door barely enough to peer. A figure stands there. clothed in a fur overcoat too elegant to be regional, carrying nothing visible. But the space around him radiates danger. He speaks one word: business. You watch him. You study his gaze, not begging, scheming. You don't reply. You close the door and wedge another log in position. Because here, amid a winter conflict nobody discusses, the single law that counts is faith, is for warmer days. It begins with the scent, a peculiar harsh odour, strange but unmistakable. Charred evergreen, perhaps, or scorched debris. You dismiss it initially because everything smells burnt in winter. Clothing, food, your own anxiety. But then it intensifies, grows sharper. The sort of smell that constricts your chest, that makes you drop your spoon, abandon conversation, rise without thinking something's amiss. The fire crackles slightly too loudly. There's a crack, sharp and dry, followed by a flash in your peripheral vision that isn't firelight flickering. You spin around just in time to witness it. A plank near the hearth, too close for too long. An ember must have jumped, caught a loose fibre or dry splinter you swore was safe. But it's blazing now, bright, quick, too quick. You don't hesitate, you react. A damp cloth, a pail of water from the melted snow container, your own covered hands. If that's what you have, you pound it down, suffocate the flames, choke on smoke, feel heat pierce through your sleeves like fangs. For several frantic moments it's mayhem, coughing, shoving, swearing, pleading, and then quiet. The fire dies, but it could have been catastrophic, it nearly was. That's the process, that's how you lose everything, because frontier shelters are constructed of timber, dried timber, open rafters, stuffed kindling walls, roofs that creak and groan with pitch and bark and straw. Everything surrounding you is essentially fuel, just awaiting an opportunity. And the flame you rely on for survival, it's indifferent. It'll betray you instantly. You become watchful after that, justifiably so. Every spark seems threatening. Every pop of the fire sounds like an alarm. Every time you double-check the hearth before sleeping, again upon waking, and at least 4 times before venturing outside. You construct a stone barrier around it, position the logs farther back, suspend a metal sheet behind the wall to redirect heat from the wood. It assists, maybe, but still there's no security when your entire home could catch fire in moments. Historical accounts overflow with cabin blazes. Most begin identically. Poorly constructed chimneys, overloaded hearths, flames placed too near curtains or hides. One disturbing story tells of a man who built his fire inside a hollow log to contain the heat. What it contained instead was his death. Nobody discovered the cabin until spring. You recall that account every time you smell something unusual. There's a frightening delicacy to your world now. The cabin feels solid in a tempest, heavy with snow on the roof. It groans like a vessel in wind. But it endures. Yet one wandering spark could transform it into a beacon in under a minute. You'd have nothing. No refuge, no provisions, no equipment. Just your clothing and the sound of flame consuming your existence. You prepare contingencies just in case. An emergency pack by the entrance, covers, preserved meat, a flint striker and blade, a pouch of plants you don't even enjoy, but might need to chew if smoke tightens your throat. You hide supplies in the shed, a shovel, a fresh pair of socks, a kettle. You practice the escape mentally, which direction to flee, where the snow's shallowest, how long it would take to dig a pit and survive the night outdoors. Because yes, you've contemplated it. If the cabin burns, you won't perish in flames. You'll die in the cold. Freezing will complete its task faster than fire ever could. Your shelter isn't just a residence, it's protective gear. One that's always slightly wet, full of pests and squeaks when you move, but armour nonetheless. You start viewing everything differently. Fuel wood isn't just energy, it's danger. Kindling gets secured in a metal container. Ashes are removed each morning and taken outside because you read about someone whose home ignited because wind scattered hot ashes from a bucket they assumed was cold. You create fire breaks. You extinguish even the coals that drop to the floor like glowing fragments, and you speak about it to yourself, to the beasts, to the silent air. You recite the guidelines, like bank the fire low at night, keep the pail full, never rest with a candle burning. These are the chants now. Not because you're frightened, though you are, but because repetition might preserve your life. It occurs again several weeks later. Not a blaze, but close. A lamp overturns while you're cleaning the flue. The oil spills, the flame flickers too high and you barely stop it before it touches the table edge. You jerk it away, hands trembling. After that, you cease using lamps unless absolutely required. Back to candles, short ones in water bowls. You even stop reading after dark. Some scholars argue that fire was a settler's greatest tool, a miracle in a box. Others call it the devil's companion, the cost paid for warmth in a world that wanted you dead. You're caught between both views. You depend on it. You dread it. It's your closest ally and your deadliest enemy. There's a reason native winter dwellings often use central fires with earth or stone bases. Less smoke, better heat management, wiser, safer. You wish you possessed that knowledge. You wish you could demolish your chimney and reconstruct it properly. But now isn't the moment for improvements. Now's the time for endless watchfulness. Still, the fear doesn't immobilize you, it focuses you. You treat fire with the respect it demands. You speak to it sometimes, not from superstition but routine. Stay in the hearth. Do your work. You praise it when it cooperates. You scold it when it sparks. You handle it like a delicate creature, one that could warm you or destroy you, depending on how well you tended it. And on the coldest nights, when the fire burns just right, the shadows dancing gently on the walls, the soup bubbling softly in its iron pot, you allow yourself to relax slightly. You tuck your feet under a cover, sip something warm, let your eyes shut. But the fire never leaves your thoughts. Not really. You sleep with one ear listening to the crackle because you know that fire isn't just a source of life. It's a predator you've welcomed into your home. You wouldn't have survived this far without her. That's simply the reality. Through blizzards, hungry weeks, dead fires, sick livestock, broken equipment, and nights so dark and endless they feel like punishment. You're here partly because she prevented it all from collapsing. She meaning the woman in the cabin. Maybe she's your spouse, your mother, your sister. Maybe she's just someone who travelled west with the same stubborn determination you carry in your bones. Whoever she is, she's the foundation of the entire enterprise, and somehow she's still upright. Frontier winters are harsh on everyone, but they demand something different from women. It's not just the physical burden, though, let's not pretend. She's chopping, carrying, repairing, mending, skinning and feeding like any man with an axe and a frozen back. It's the endless burden, the unbroken weight of caring, planning, healing, feeding, watching and waiting, of mending wounds inside and out, of keeping a family and a flame alive simultaneously. The first thing she does at dawn is begin working, not that she ever truly stopped. Even at night she's sleeping in shifts, listening for the fire dying or the baby crying or the wind shifting or you rising to battle the outhouse with a lantern and a muttered oath. If the fire's dead, she lights it. If someone's ill, she brews tea. If the soup needs stretching, she adds more water and somehow makes it taste better than the previous evening. You've watched her perform impossible arithmetic with ingredients that don't calculate. 1 onion, half a carrot, a pinch of salt, and she creates a meal that fills your stomach and calms your spirit. She doesn't grumble. She can't grumble because if she falters, everyone else crumbles. There's a quiet strength in her movements. No theatrics, no proclamations of power, just motion, purpose. A rhythm of survival so embedded it appears effortless until you try to substitute for a day and realise how much you've overlooked. One night your youngest develops a fever, high, hot, terrifying. You panic. She doesn't. She dampens rags, feeds the fire, measures doses of willow bark and pine tea with a doctor's precision. She cradles the child's head through the worst tremors, whispers old songs like protection, and doesn't sleep for 2 straight days, and when the fever subsides she still prepares breakfast. You don't express gratitude, not immediately, maybe not ever, as she deserves. Because here more thanks are expressed through actions, through chopping extra wood so she doesn't need to, through sewing a patch where the cabin draft hits her side of the bed, through fixing the door that always jams. You don't need to tell her she's preserving your lives, she knows. Historically, women on the frontier managed everything inside the home and frequently outside it. They were midwives, hunters, healers, butchers, teachers and scouts. Some delivered children in snowstorms, others buried husbands and managed, raised 5 children alone through winters that would make your bones cry. And the records, they barely acknowledge them. A sentence here, a footnote there. But behind every named settler, there's almost always an unnamed woman who kept him alive. There's a frontier tale from a Wisconsin homestead, 1871. Young woman, recently wed, husband departs hunting, never comes back. She endures the remaining winter alone, keeps the animals from freezing, snares rabbits, trades her final 3 potatoes for firewood. When spring arrives, the neighbours discover her chopping wood in a coat sewn together from 3 quilts and what was likely her wedding gown. She offers them soup, smiles as if nothing occurred. The strength you observe in the women here. It's quiet. That's the aspect people overlook. It's not flashy. It's not loud. It's in how she knits by firelight with hands cracked from hauling water all day. In how she soaks her own socks in warm water so the children can have dry ones. In how she doesn't flinch when a storm hammers the roof. She just checks the buckets, seals the gaps, adds more soup to the pot, and she endures the cold in her own way, with layers, naturally, but also with determination. There's something brutal and beautiful about how she pulls on a coat with a broken clasp, ties it with string, and steps outside into the wind to haul snow like she's got something to prove to the blizzard. But winter's not just hard on the body, it erodes the spirit too, and that's where you see her struggle most. The endless grey sky, the isolation, the monotony of each day. It weighs on her just like it weighs on you. But she continues. Not because she doesn't feel it, but because someone must appear unaffected. For the children, for you, for the structure of everything. You catch her staring out the window sometimes, or at what used to be a window now boarded and sealed. She stands there holding a cup of pine tea, watching snow drift past the roof corners like ashes. She doesn't speak. You don't interrupt, that's her moment, her refuge. She keeps journals when she can spare the paper. Small notes, lists, sometimes just a word. Alive. You've read over her shoulder once or twice. There's poetry there, real poetry. You wonder what kind of life she might have had elsewhere, somewhere warmer, somewhere with clean linens and lemon in her tea. But she chose this. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe the world offered her no alternatives. Either way, she's here. And she's the reason you're here. So you learn to step up, to carry more, to cook, sometimes to tend the fire so she can rest. You teach the older children how to mend a shirt. You hang the washing for once. You handle the firewood run. Not as a favour, as acknowledgement. Because in this cabin, in this world where survival is a daily negotiation between wind and warmth, she's not just assistance, she's the centre. You tuck the covers around her shoulders. When she finally falls asleep, you tend the fire quietly so it doesn't wake her. You pour the tea before she asks. And when the storm strikes again, because it always does, you stand beside her at the door, shoulder to shoulder, and face it together. The snow never ceases, not really. It hesitates, lightens, takes a break. But then it starts again. A gentle sprinkling becomes a swirl becomes a gale. And before long it's falling in curtains thick as fabric and twice as heavy. It accumulates high against the cabin walls, smothers the woodpile, buries the privy, and eliminates the path to the stream like it never existed. This isn't your first tempest, but this one feels different, larger, heavier, like the heavens themselves have grown weary and decided to come crashing down. You witnessed it approaching. The air went motionless earlier that day, the way it always does before the sky collapses. The hound grew silent. The chickens ruffled and settled deep, refusing to move from their corner. The fire seemed harder to maintain, like even it sensed something was wrong. By dusk, the horizon vanished behind a wall of white, and by nightfall you couldn't see 5 feet beyond the cabin window. You prepare. There's nothing else to do. You inspect everything. Shutters secured, roof reinforced, firewood stacked high inside. You move the animals closer, if not already sharing the same space with you, which they essentially are now. You heat water, you collect blankets, you count the matches and whisper a quiet vow to every last one. And then you wait. The wind strikes first. A low groan, almost like a warning. Then a full-throated roar that rattles the door and whistles through every imperfect joint in the walls. You feel it in your teeth. It presses down on the roof like a giant's palm, pushing, testing. You inspect the beams, the rafters. They hold for now. And then the snow joins in. It's not flakes anymore. It's fragments, crystals, whipped sideways by a wind that's gone from roaring to shrieking. You feel it even through the wall, a pulse of rage just inches away. It's like the world outside wants in, wants to crack you open and scatter what's left of you across the white inside. Mayhem creeps forward at a crawling pace. The blaze sputters weakly. Window frames tremble with force. Icy air slips through every opening, around each nail and timber. You jam them with fabric pieces, old socks, strips of weathered fur. It's never sufficient. The cold drops anyway. Rest disappears. No one sleeps. You take turns, stoking the fire, passing blankets like exhausted phantoms. The dog tightens its curl. The goat moans in slumber. The youngest begins soft sobbing, too drained for noise. You soothe them, not with words but with warmth. Your hands, your body, your presence. There's a moment near Menard when the blizzard reaches its fury. The whole cabin groans like it's being ripped apart. Walls flexing with every gust. Snow bursts through gaps in fine white dust, covering your table, your boots, the floor. You sweep it over and over like it helps. You consider moving everyone to the root cellar in case the roof fails. It's been attempted before. There's a record from an 1830s storm where a family survived 3 days buried with pickled eggs and a hidden fowl and a lamp that lasted barely enough time. You haven't reached that desperation, but you prepare a strategy, just to be ready. By dawn, the tempest weakens but continues. It's quieter, more dangerous now, the kind of stillness that conceals threat beneath beauty. You force the door open to inspect the damage, and it takes all your force to push it open, even inches. Snow has piled up to the doorframe's top, creating a solid white wall that hisses frigid air into your face like a warning. You're buried in. Not symbolically. Actually. The cabin has become an island in an ocean of snow. The trail to the wood stack is vanished. The outhouse. Don't consider it. You can't see beyond a foot outside the entrance. You're imprisoned temporarily. The reality begins settling in. Being snowbound sounds appealing when it's merely words. Folks return eastward, compose ballads about it. They envision comfortable blazes, shared wraps, a kettle of broth simmering while joy echoes through the space. Sure, you have flames, you have broth, but the joy, that's more difficult. There's little amusing about watching timber groan beneath 3 feet of compressed snow while questioning how long your fuel pile will endure. You limit movement. No needless journeys across the room. Each stride costs body warmth. Every opened entrance bleeds heat. You reorganize the dwelling. gathering everyone and everything beside the fireplace, forming a tight, warm, somewhat odorous circle of endurance. It functions mainly, but provisions become problematic quicker than expected. You possessed enough for 5 days. The storm's already into day 4, and the snow displays no indication of ceasing you. Extend meals, reduced servings, additional water, broth that's really just heated liquid with hints of taste. It's insufficient. Everyone senses it. You abandon using dishes. No plates to wash means fewer excursions outside with frozen digits. One evening, someone cracks a joke. It's not humorous, but everyone chuckles regardless. Not because it's clever, but because it shatters the quiet. Because sometimes laughter is all that prevents terror from settling. Shot behind your chest, you observe things you missed: the current from the western barrier, how one support creaks when wind strikes precisely right, the fissure in the ceiling you swore wasn't present last week, the pail of snow melting beside the fire that now tastes faintly of ash and hopelessness. There's peculiar magnificence, though, in this sort of imprisonment. A forced unity. No diversions, no rushing off to repair fencing or check snares or debate chores. Just you, your family, your livestock, and the storm. And in that frozen cocoon, you discover things about one another. About endurance, about resistance, resilience. You observe the snow climbing higher on the glass each day. Eventually it blocks all illumination. The dwelling becomes a cavern. Time distorts. You slumber when exhausted, consume when possible, speak when someone shatters the stillness. The external world seems imaginary. Only this exists. Finally, it concludes, not suddenly. The wind dies initially. The snow softens. The sky, after days of angry grey, transforms to pale blue that nearly pains to observe. You excavate your path with a spade and hatchet, chopping through snow that feels like packed stone. It requires hours, but when you emerge into open air again, when sunlight touches your face, you nearly forget the hardship. Nearly. Then you observe the dwelling, ice clinging to the roof, the entrance hanging askew, smoke spiralling upward in tired coils. And you sense it. You didn't merely survive the storm, you outlasted it. The calendar reads March, but you don't trust it. The light lingers slightly longer each evening. True, there's gentleness to the sun that almost feels like a vow. But you've been deceived before. And here on the frontier, spring isn't a tender arrival. It's a deceiver, a tease. One day it grants you warmth on your spine, and the next it buries you in snow so deep you begin whispering apologies to the calendar for ever believing it. You desire it to finish desperately. You want to step outside and smell something besides smoke, animals, or damp wool. You want to witness green, anything green. Even fungus at this point would be a welcome burst of colour. But mostly you want to feel warm without having to deserve it. Without splitting logs, without adding layers, without clustering like a guilty raccoon beside the fire. So when the first thaw arrives, it feels like fantasy. The icicles dripping, the crunch of snow softening to slush. You catch water flowing in tiny streams down the slope and your heart soars. The sun touches your face for more than 10 minutes and you close your eyes like some half-thawed lizard absorbing divine light. You even remove a layer of clothing. Just one. Just for an hour. But it feels magnificent. Then, naturally, comes the betrayal. Because spring doesn't arrive in a direct line. It stumbles, it deceives, it grants you hope, and then snatches it away like a playful child. One day it's birdsong and muddy boots. The next, the sudden squall batters you in the face with wind and wet snow, heavier than anything you recall from December. You can witness the buds on the trees so close to bursting. But they're not foolish. They know better. They wait. You, however, begin to unravel. There's something about nearly escaping that breaks a person more than the worst part of winter ever could. You were strong when it was all cold and grey. You expected it. You endured. But this is the emotional equivalent of being halfway through the door and then getting locked inside again. You're so close to making it, but the season just keeps slamming its frosty boot into your back and shoving you down. The food stores are nearly depleted now, no more flour. The last of the beans have been scraped from the barrel. The pickles are soft, sour, and suspiciously fizzy. You boiled them anyway. Regret followed shortly after. You either seed potatoes, but know you'll need them for planting if the ground ever thaws. You once joked that snow would fall on your grave. Now you're starting to think that was less of a joke and more of a prophecy. Historically, March was often the most brutal month for frontier families. Food at its scarcest, roads still impassable, storms still lurking. They called it the starving time for a reason. There are records of families grinding tree bark into flour substitutes, eating boiled leather from old boots, making tea from pine needles and lies. One account even talks about chewing candle wax for calories. You read that and laughed back in October. You're not laughing now. The animals are restless too. The goat bleats constantly. The dog just stares at the door like it might. Will it open into a better world? The chickens. You're not sure if they're molting or plotting a coup. Feathers everywhere, no eggs. Just judgmental clucking and little beady eyes that seem to say this is your fault. Even your body starts playing tricks on you. You feel spring in your muscles. You want to move more, stretch, do things again, but there's nowhere to go. Every time you try to walk beyond the cabin, the snow collapses beneath your boots and soaks your socks with icy slush. Slush. There's no traction, just slop and frostbite. You get reckless, a little wild. You think, maybe I'll just take a walk. Anyway, maybe if you pretend it's spring, it'll become spring. You step outside, no hat, coat half buttoned. 5 minutes later your ears are numb, your boots are full of water, and your courage has frozen somewhere near your ankles. You drag yourself back inside, defeated by a month that's neither winter nor spring, but a kind of cursed in between. Purgatory. One eccentric settler's journal from the Dakotas describes March as the month when mud has the consistency of cake batter and your hope turns sour, like bad milk. That feels about right? Still. Yeah, there are signs. You try not to be superstitious, but you notice the ice on the creek is thinning. You spot a single bird, not the big grumpy winter crows, but something smaller, flightier. A promise with feathers. One morning the wind shifts. Warmer, damp, not bitter. You don't trust it, but you feel it. There's something deeply emotional about hearing the first drip from the eaves. After weeks of silence, it's just water. But to you it sounds like music, like progress, like the world beginning to remember that life exists outside of survival. You open the cabin door just a little wider now. Let the air in, even if it's still cold. You sweep the floor, even though it'll just get dirty again. You find your seed packets and go through them with grim hope, planning, dreaming. Maybe next week you can start something. Maybe. But you don't let yourself believe it fully yet. Not until the snow is truly gone. Not until the mud dries and the first green thing pokes through and doesn't get covered again the next day by a freak snowstorm. Until then, you hold on. You watch the skies. You ration what's left. You tell yourself stories. You remind the others that every storm has an end, even if it lies. Because the cruelest part of the frontier winter isn't January, it's the lie of March. Then one morning, it happens. Not with a roar or a fanfare or even an announcement, just subtly, quietly, like the world changing its mind. You open the door expecting the usual blast of damp cold or that usual uniquely hateful smell of late-season slush. But instead, you smell dirt. Actual dirt, not mud, not rot. Earth. Warm, slightly sweet, real. You stand there barefoot on the wooden threshold, blinking into the pale sunlight like some creature emerging from a cave. The snow has receded enough to see patches of brown. Not green, not yet, but brown that feels like a miracle all on its own. The top layer of the garden bed is soft. You press a finger into gives way, damp, crumbly, eager. After months of ice and fire and silence, the world has started whispering again. Spring, the real kind, doesn't arrive like a parade. It arrives like a quiet exhale, like a held breath finally released. You don't even notice the exact moment when the snow vanishes from the path. But one day your boots hit packed earth instead of ice. One day the animals start poking their noses out and not immediately regretting it. One day you open the window and leave it open. Of course it's still cold. The mornings are sharp, the nights biting. But there's a difference in the cold now. It no longer feels permanent. You can feel the sun fighting it. The days stretch. Light creeps further into the corners of the cabin. There's warmth in the beams again. You stop living in a tight huddle around the hearth. You start sitting near the door. It's planting season. That phrase used to mean little to you, just a chore, a word on a calendar. Now it feels like salvation, the act of taking something tiny, pressing it into the earth and believing, truly believing, that something will come from it. That's faith, and you're desperate for faith. You take stock of your seeds. You know them like our old friends now. Beans, carrots, kale, some squash that might be too ambitious. But hope makes you reckless. You hold at each packet like it's made of gold. These aren't just seeds. They're next winter's survival insurance. You dig with frozen fingers and sore knees, still sore from sleeping on too many hard floors and not enough blankets. You turn the soil. You clear the old dead stalks. You work in silence, because it feels sacred. The dog lays nearby, so soaking up the sun like a solar panel for joy. Even the chickens stop their constant judgment and begin scratching the thawed dirt with what you choose to interpret as approval. There's a moment, maybe the first truly peaceful moment in months, when you pause, hands in the soil, breath coming easy, sun on your face, and you realize you're alive. You made it. Not unscarred, not unchanged, but alive, and that's no small thing. You think of those who didn't, of the stories you read, the cabins that never opened again, the beds that stayed empty. You remember the storm nights, the hunger, the fire that almost got out of control, the strange man knocking in the dark. You remember the days when you were sure your body couldn't take another hour of cold, and you remember her, the woman who held it all together. You glance toward the cabin, where she's hanging laundry for the first time in months, her sleeves rolled, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright again. She catches your look and raises an eyebrow like she's reading your thoughts and already bored of them. You grin. She doesn't grin back, she never does, but she nods. That's enough. Inside you've started cleaning. Not just tidying, but reclaiming, washing soot from the walls, scrubbing floors that haven't seen daylight since November. You throw out the bucket you kept for emergencies, with small, sombre ceremony. You repurpose the box of rags into actual cleaning cloths, and instead of makeshift insulation, the whole cabin feels lighter, as if it knows the fight is over. You even let yourself dream again about fixing the roof properly, about adding another window, about raising a second pig so the first one finally has someone else to grunt at. The world is wide again, and you can feel it calling. Historically, frontier families treated spring not with celebration, but with cautious joy. They knew how cruel the season could be. Floods, late frosts, sicknesses that bloomed in the thaw. But they also knew it was the time to build again. To rebuild, really. Because winter didn't just pause life, it shattered it. Spring was the glue. One quirky entry from an 1851 homesteader notes that the first day I hung laundry, without it freezing to the bone stiff, made me weep into the bread dough. You understand that kind of joy now. It's not dramatic, it's just human. You celebrate with the smallest feast, what's left of the last smoked meat, a fresh egg and a pancake made from desperation. And a pinch of hope tastes better than anything you had all winter. You eat it outside, perched on a stump, like it's a royal banquet. There's work ahead. You're behind on planting. The fence needs mending, the roof still leaks. The creek is rising a little too fast and your boots are still full of holes. You need more salt, more oil, more everything, but none of that scares you because the cold is gone, the dark is broken, and now you get to build. There's a strange ache that comes when the worst is over. Not physical though, your joints are stiff and your back has the familiar curve of someone who spent too many months hauling, chopping, bending, surviving. No, this ache is emotional. It sits behind your ribs and hums like a tuning fork. It's the realization that somehow you're not fighting for your life anymore. Not today, anyway. And when the fight fades, you're left with you and everything you've been holding off, feeling. The first few days of true spring are filled with noise. Not from people. You're still in the middle of nowhere, but from the world itself. The thaw is loud. It drips and trickles and runs in rivulets down hillsides. The creeks are swollen and the wind doesn't scream anymore. It sings. Birds return in waves, as if the sky opened and dropped them back where the play belonged. Even the trees seem to exhale, creaking and swaying as they stretch from their long frozen sleep. You stand in the middle of it, watching the cabin shrink behind you as you walk toward the edge of your tiny known world. The same path you trudged in snowshoes 3 months ago now squishes underfoot, full of magic mud and promise. The same trees that once loomed in white silence now shimmer with tiny buds, so small you could miss them if you weren't paying attention. But you are. Now more than ever, you find yourself touching everything. A leaf, a rock warmed by sun, the bark of a tree. Not for any practical reason, just to prove it's all real, that the nightmare season has passed and the world is letting you be. Back in, you don't rush. You walk slowly like someone relearning the shape of the earth. The animals are different too. The chickens begin laying again, almost apologetically. The goat walks farther, sniffing everything like it's new. Even the pig, still smug, still muddy, grunts with something like satisfaction as he sunbathes in a dry patch of grass you didn't think would exist ever again. And you begin to do something radical. Rest. Not collapse, not pass out from exhaustion, but rest. Sit in a chair for more than 5 minutes. Stare at the trees. Close your eyes in the sun, without a voice in your head screaming, "Get up." The fire's low. You're behind on kindling. There's a draft somewhere. The silence becomes soothing, not alarming. You stop jumping at every sound. You stop checking the windows every few minutes, scanning for wolves, raiders, the cold itself. You let your guard down a little. There's an emotional detox that happens after surviving a winter like that. The body recovers faster than the mind, and physically you're eating better, moving easier, sleeping deeper. But mentally, you still find yourself flinching at shadows. You still wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, only to realize the fire's burning fine and no one's dying. It's hard to explain to someone who's never lived through it, the way fear burrows in, the way survival becomes not just something you do, but something you are. And then suddenly it's not needed. You're still braced, but nothing's coming. There's no storm, no cold, just wind and light and the faint smell of blossoms. One morning you catch your reflection in a puddle. You almost don't recognize it. Your face is leaner, the lines are deeper, but your eyes, they're awake in a way they weren't a few months ago, like the part of you that went underground for the winter has returned. Blinking in the light, slightly disoriented but very much alive, you remember the mistakes you made, the fire that almost took the cabin, the time you rationed food too tightly, and everyone went to bed hungry, the trap that didn't work, the deal you almost made with a stranger you didn't trust, the bottle you dipped into too many nights. You carry those things, not with shame, at least not entirely, but with honesty. Because survival isn't clean, it's gritty and reactive and instinctual. You did what you had to, and you learned. Every mistake became a notch on your ribs, every lesson etched into the grain of your axe handle. You made it. And now you begin again. You start fixing what broke, patching leaks in the roof, replacing window coverings with real glass if you can scrounge it. You plan your planting with more precision than ever. You even sketch a new shed you might build in the summer, now that you know how small and vulnerable your storage really was. And the people, the ones in your cabin, they change too slowly. The kids start laughing louder. The woman, your wife, your partner, your anchor, sings again while kneading dough, a tune you haven't heard since before the snow. You hum along off-key and she rolls her eyes, but she doesn't stop. You begin trading again. Real trading, not desperate. Late winter bartering for dry beans and rabbit fur, but neighbourly exchanges. Seeds, tools, news. You hear stories of others who made it and those who didn't. You grieve quietly, privately. But you also celebrate one quirky fact from a 19th century frontier. Families would sometimes mark the true end of winter with a picnic, even if they had nothing to eat but dry bread and warm water. Just the act of sitting in the sun together outside was enough. A symbol, a line drawn between what was and what will be. You do your own version. A bench, a cup of fresh tea, the sun, a kiss dance that feels earned. And in that moment, you realise something else. You didn't just survive the coldest nights. You earned the right to live through the warm ones. You built this life through mistakes, sweat, ingenuity, and sheer refusal to die. No one back east will ever understand what that cost, how close you came to disappearing. But you'll know. Every time the wind shifts and carries the scent of SAP and soil instead of death, you'll know. And now that spring's here and truly here, not just whispering empty promises behind frozen clouds, you finally rest easy. Not because you're done, no one on the frontier is ever done, but because you've proven that you can do this. When the cold howled, you stayed warm. When the food ran low, you stretched it. When the dark crept in, you lit a fire and kept it alive. This life, it isn't pretty. It's not romantic, but it's real. And it's yours. Next winter will come again. It always does. But now you won't fear it the same way. You'll remember the warmth you made from nothing. The soup you conjured from scraps. The laughter that still rose in a one-room cabin half buried in snow. And when the nights grow long again, you'll light your fire, pull on your beaver fur mittens and smile because you've been through worse. You'll stir the stew, check the windows and settle in not with dread but with memory because you survived the coldest nights. And now you sleep in warmth you earned.